Testing 1 2 3. Testing 1 2 3. This is Radio Free Mormon on the air, broadcasting behind enemy lines. Tonight's episode is The Light on Truth Letter, Chapter 1, Manipulations and Logical Fallacies. That's a long title, but it's going to be well worth it. We've got a great show lined up for you. The first thing I have to say is that, yes, I know that it was only a week ago that I did an introductory episode on the Light and Truth Letter and then pronounced at the end it was not worth my time and I would not be revisiting it. Well, here I am. That was one of those temporary commandments, I think, that Elder Oaks taught us about in the last General Conference. You know, I'm starting to like that doctrine. I think there's a lot of good uses for that new doctrine. But anyway, what we're going to do is this. What happened was this, is that Colby Reddish, the attorney that everybody loves, contacted me. And he was so enthusiastic about maybe getting together and doing a joint episode on the first chapter of the Light and Truth Letter that I said, okay, yeah, it's always great to have Colby on. I would probably talk about anything with Colby. We're going to bring him on now, and he can explain that all of this is true, and I have not emphasized or exaggerated a single word of it. There he is. There's the man, the myth, the legend, Colby Reddish.
Hey, RFM. Thanks for having me back.
You're welcome. Now, did I get anything wrong in that introduction?
You got everything spot on. And the reason that I wanted to cover the first chapter is because the overarching message of your first episode about the Light and Truth Letter was that you read one chapter and decided enough was enough for you. I only read the first chapter because reading the first chapter in the introduction gave me everything I needed to know about Austin Fife and the quality of his apologetics. And so that was kind of the common theme, was you were done after the church finances section. I was done after the logical fallacies and manipulations section. And so thought it'd be fun to cover together.
And I agree. Excuse me for a second while I crack open a cold one. That's good. All right. So we've got some slides, and you put some slides together. By the way, everybody, if you like this, you know, we can maybe renew the contract, maybe get a series going on each of the chapters in this book. Colby's up for it. I said, if he's up for it, I'm up for it. If there's a desire to hear about that. And once again, I think this just came out in August. That's the date that it's signed on at the beginning, or at least that's where the forward is. And so August, September, October, I mean, this may end up in a lot of people's Christmas stockings. And if you want to have something to say in response in a detailed way regarding each chapter, we're there for you. Just let us know in the live chat or in the comments below. Okay, thanks so much. So I've got a slides. You did that slide yourself.
I did.
Can you explain the slide for us?
Yeah, so I named our presentation very close to your naming. I liked your phrase, the Light on Truth Letter, because I think it's an apt description.
Yes, thank you. I forgot to say that. That's the bit I've got to start each show with. Yeah. The Light on Truth Letter. It's kind of heavy on deception, but it's light on truth.
Yeah. And originally I had it, Radio Free Mormon featuring some rando on the internet in quotations. People who know will get that inside joke. And you said, no, I want your name on it. So there you go. That's crossed out. And my name's there as well.
Yes. I want your name on it, man. You're going to have to account for everything you say. Okay. So let's see what the next slide is, because I know these first few slides you contributed to the deck.
I did. Yeah. So really, I thought it would just be interesting to remind people, if they haven't seen it. Most people have probably seen your first episode, but in your first episode, you basically covered the church finances section. You selected that section because you wanted to see how Austin Fife dealt with the SEC order from February of 2023.
Yes, Austin Fife, by the way, the author of the Light on Truth Letter.
That's right. If I remember correctly, didn't we talk about the SEC order last year sometime on some show?
Oh, I'm sure we have.
Okay.
It's been all the talk everywhere. You'd have to be not just a rock, but hidden under a rock to not know about it if you're a Mormon.
Yeah. Well, and because we're both practicing attorneys, well, I know you're retired, but because we're both attorneys, we're interested in that type of document and can understand it a little bit better and can explain to people who have questions. That's one of the reasons. Well, frankly, I just was shocked that the SEC as a federal regulatory agency would go after a church. For them to make that decision, the file must have been just so clear, having worked for regulation, for regulators in the past. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
it would have had to have been so clear because of the political consequences for the agency in taking that type of action.
Mm-hmm.
Mm-hmm.
That makes sense to me. Absolutely. So on the previous RFM, I had talked about the fact that I really chose that chapter because I wanted to see how the author, Austin Fife, son of Barney, was going to address the issue of the SEC scandal. And I was scandalized to find out he didn't mention it at all in that chapter.
In that chapter, that's interesting. We'll come back to that.
Okay, because you found something which will be very interesting. First off, before we even come back to it, we had talked on the phone, and I know you had said he was in a double bind over that.
I did, yeah. And actually, it's the double bind has been revealed as just a single bind, and we'll get to why in a second. But what I meant by that is a double bind is basically a situation where you're damned if you do, damned if you don't, right? You're in a no-win scenario, a Kobayashi Maru, if you will. And what I mean by that is Austin Fife either knowingly omitted the SEC order and the significance of that in his chapter on church finances, which I really can't imagine anything more relevant to talking about the church's finances in 2024 than a federal regulatory agency taking action against the church for its financial misdeeds in 2023. So either he willingly and knowingly omitted it, or he's so incompetent that he didn't know about it. Either way, why would anyone listen to him on the topic of church finances? That was the double bind that I felt like he was in after listening to your first episode.
Got it. Thank you so much. Oh, yes. And in the comment section of that first episode, I was flattered that Light and Truth Letter himself, Austin Fife, apparently weighed in. And so I put these comments up here. This was actually the night of the show, not long after it was over.
Mm-hmm.
And he wrote, Austin Fife writing, I believe, thanks for taking the time to review. To clarify, not a 10-year faith crisis. And I suddenly came back this year. That's what I had represented it as in the show because I was confused. It was a little bit confusing. I think I was legitimately confused on that.
Yeah, the story doesn't make a whole lot of sense.
Okay, but he says to clarify, not a 10-year faith crisis, and I suddenly came back this year. I had a faith crisis 10 years ago, and this letter is my 10-year check-in. That is a helpful clarification, by the way.
Sure.
And then he said, very much a one-man show, referring to himself, I believe, and a handful of friends and family that helped edit. I am complimented by those that believe an organization is behind the letter. Enjoy. And I thought that was nice. I thought that was a rather bon vivant, if that is an actual expression in French, of him to come by and say hello. The thing that shocked me, though, was that after watching the show where I take him to task on fact after fact after fact after fact of the way he's addressing or not addressing, more likely, the different issues, the only clarification that he wants to post there has to do with the timing of his faith crisis. He doesn't appear to want to clarify anything else.
Right. It's astounding. In that same comment thread, he was asked more directly what he thought of your episode. I don't see it here, so I'll just explain. And he said that you engaged in a hasty generalization. Right. He accused you of engaging in a hasty generalization because you only read one section of the letter before commenting on it. And we'll get to this a little bit later, but it's not a hasty generalization to comment on the part of the letter you read, as long as you're very clear about the section of the letter you read. This isn't like a Brian Hales book review where you just review a book that you haven't read. You were very clear about the things that you read.
Was that the 3-star? Was it book review for Dan Vogel, or it was a 2-star, I think?
I think it was 2 stars. I'm just going to see if I can piss off every Mormon.
If he'd really read it, it might have gone down to 1 star.
Yeah, probably.
So anyway, that happened, and yeah, that happened. And someone else who apparently is in favor of light and truth commented, this is also last episode, the same night it premiered. It says, RFM really doesn't want you to read the light and truth letter, ... Interesting. And I thought that was a strange thing to say. However, Super Nathan with 5 sevens came back immediately and said what I was thinking. Really? He's reading it on the screen.
Can I just parrot Elder Oaks and say, we've been hiding that for a long time, haven't we?
Yes. And someone else says, Jake says, why would you think this? And then JC really details it exactly, I think. Exactly where did he say that? No, he does not want to bother with the whole thing, as he was a clever apologist for years. Thank you. And knows all the arguments and tricks. He took a sample chapter to see if there was anything valid to review, took it apart, and wisely decided to stop there. Well, I guess so much for my wise decision there. To stop there. RFM is the last person to discourage anyone to read it. He just wants people to dive into all the evidence and consider it and make up one's mind. Until any new, better, more valid and convincing information may appear. That is the essence of reality testing. Thank you very much, JC. Absolutely. I could not have put that better myself. So, did you have any comments about it before I went to the next slide?
Well, I think it links really well to our next slide. So I'll make my comment in the context of the next slide. So in the title, I had the name Poe's Law. And this is something that I was joking about with you on the phone when we talked about doing this episode. Poe's Law is just an adage of internet culture, right? It's just a meme of internet culture that says any sarcastic expression or parody of an extreme view can be mistaken by some readers for a sincere expression of those views. It actually came from a debate on evolution on a Christian message board, where the eponymous, I think it's Nathan Poe, said, without a winking smiley or another blatant display of humor, it is utterly impossible to parody a creationist in such a way that someone won't mistake it for the genuine article. And the reason I wanted to talk about Poe's Law just briefly is because the time that the first time I read the first chapter of the Light and Truth Letter, I legitimately believed it was parody. Whether it was,
really?
I really truly did. And we'll talk
suspect
about
Streeter.
That's what I was going to say.
I always suspect Streeter.
Yeah, always suspect Streeter when there's parody that's gone wrong. No, but the reason that I thought that is because the arguments in the first chapter were just so bad, and I saw it getting shared on so many of the Psych Ward Radio, Jacob Hansen, they all had on Austin Fife to talk about the Light and Truth Letter. And I just honestly couldn't believe someone could read through the first chapter and think this was something worth, trumpeting about. I'll go back to the earlier comments too, and just say, it kind of links in with the same kind of worldview as the person who made that comment on a video where you're reading the Light and Truth Letter, saying RFM really doesn't want you to read the Light and Truth Letter. Sometimes these positions that are taken by these junior level apologists are so ridiculous. I really do immediately in my mind go to parody instead of just that level of disconnection from reality and competence.
And there's a couple of reasons for that, and I know we'll get to that here in a couple of minutes. Now, this is a slide that is from the Light on Truth Letter. It's called Manipulation and Fallacies. It's probably the very top part. Questions and concerns, and then there's a paragraph that you had wanted to include in the deck, Colby.
Yeah, I think just to give people a feel for Austin's introduction before we get into the manipulation and fallacy section, I think this episode will only cover like one or two of the fallacies. Mostly we're going to cover the 10 manipulation tactics he accuses critics of the church of using. And so he basically says, initially during my faith crisis in 2014, I still would love more details on Austin's supposed faith crisis. And I don't say that to engage in, gatekeeping or no true Scotsman, no true ex-Mormon or something like that. But I will just say, and I'm open to your opinion on this as well, as I've listened to Austin, as I've read the first chapter that Austin wrote, and I also read the church finances section after you did your review on it in the last episode, and then I've listened to him talk, I just am not seeing the markers in the way he talks of someone who really engaged in any level of deconstruction. And what I mean by that is, for someone who supposedly listened to hundreds of hours of Mormon stories, it's difficult for me to believe that someone who had done that could still come so directly after someone like John Dehlin or someone like you, and call you guys anti-Mormons or call you just church critics. From the people I've talked to online, people who return to faith after having had a faith crisis generally become a lot more nuanced, a lot less into this whole team sport apologetics nonsense. And so I'll just say that. I'm not saying that he's not being honest, but every time I think he's been asked more questions about what that faith crisis looked like on the interviews I've watched, I've never heard a real good explanation that makes me go, okay, well, yeah, he definitely had a faith crisis exactly like I did and returned to faith. It just doesn't seem to be the same type of deconstruction.
Well, would you go ahead and read? Because I tend to agree with you there. Obviously, I'm not a mind reader. However, the bolded sentence, and this was bolded in the original, this is bolded by Austin Fife himself, is something that I never would have written as a description of my faith crisis.
Yep, exactly. Yeah.
By the way, for the record, because there are people who will just be listening to this, I apologize. Colby, the sentence we're talking about that he wrote is, I started to believe the critics.
Right. So I'll read the rest of this paragraph. He says, I felt like we were a like-minded group of enlightened non-believers. My experience in the church had been so positive that even when my doubts deepened, I was convinced that the church was a force for good in the world. Gradually, that changed. And this is that bolded sentence. I started to believe the critics. The more I heard from disillusioned members, the more I felt like maybe I was wrong about the Church of Jesus Christ. Perhaps the church is much worse than I ever realized. And then I think the very next, if you'll go to the next slide, I think that's the very next paragraph. Unless you had any thoughts on this one.
No, just to once again to emphasize, I would never describe my faith crisis, putting that in air quotes now, as I started to believe the critics. It's not about believing anybody. Right. It's about looking at documents. It's about looking at facts, and it's about putting everything together. It's not about, oh, I think John Dehlin is more trustworthy than Gordon B. Hinckley. That's not what it's about.
I do think that, but you're right. It's not about that.
Yeah. And maybe it was. I don't know. Maybe it was for Austin. But if it was that way for Austin, then it becomes much more clear to me why it would be easier for him to come back to the church, because he hasn't actually had to deal with the issues himself.
Right. And I think that's one of the things about just kind of the level of deconstruction I'm talking about. And again, I want to be careful here because I'm not trying to say that Austin's lying. I'm just saying I've talked to a lot of people who've deconstructed at this point. My wife and I were at Thrive in Salt Lake just a few weeks ago, and we talked to probably 50, 60 people that day. I just have never seen someone who's actually gone through what my faith crisis looked like or has gone through a level of deconstruction talk in the way that Austin talks. It's ironic to me that as an ex-Mormon, I have the Joseph Smith Papers project like as a bookmark on my Google Chrome. That's how often I'm looking at primary stuff, because that was one of the prime ways I did research. Anyways, just kind of beyond the point, I'll read these next two paragraphs here. Austin says, and he bolds this as well, all the bolding was original. So he says, I was ready to leave, but there was a problem, and that's in bold. I am not sure when it happened, but eventually I started noticing a long list of techniques being employed against me by critics of the church. I could begin to see that I was being tricked into accepting false premises and half-truths. And starting at tricked, that sentence is bolded as well. That is when I developed serious concerns about how critics made their case.
Below, when I developed serious concerns about how the church made its case.
Yeah, I was going to say.
And I found out that I was tricked into accepting false premises and half-truths.
Yeah, exactly right. That's the thing that's so funny about this team sport nonsense at the beginning of this letter, is this letter is not written. I know it starts in the introduction saying to critics of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, but it's not written to critics of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It's not written to people who've left the church. It's written to people who are in the church and want to feel better about what they already believe. And the way I would posit that is I haven't heard from a single person that read this letter as like a fully deconstructed ex-Mormon that said, oh, that answered all my questions. I mean, you already highlighted in the first episode how it doesn't talk about one of the most significant current events that confronted the church in the last year. And so,
and then when it comes to the three issues or 3 or 4 issues that it purports to address, it doesn't address them.
right. And so that's
He's
what I
very
mean.
good at not addressing issues.
Yeah, it's desperately, much like you focused on with Bill on Mormonism Live, apologetics these days is all about running from criticism, running from what the prophets and apostles have already said, running from what the Book of Mormon says, running from what the Bible says. All they're doing is making the church unfalsifiable more and more day after day after day. That's the apologetic exercise at this point, because there is just simply no other defense. There's no other trick. You can't manufacture, New World archaeological evidence that supports the Book of Mormon. So that's what
people have, I believe.
That's true. People have. Ask Rob Meldrum. He's got some of it.
Yes, and I don't know that they did it to support the Book of Mormon, but they did it to support the mound builder myth, which, because the Book of Mormon was based on it, ended up supporting the Book of Mormon. Okay, never mind. See, was it the Bat Creek Stone?
Right, Bat Creek Stone is an example.
Tennessee. Yep. That's just one of a number of fake ancient Hebrew artifacts that were made by Americans and then pretended to be found in order to support the worldview that they had, that the Native Americans were descended from the Hebrews.
Right. And so the 3 paragraphs we've read, they serve as Austin's introduction to this long list of manipulations and fallacies. And we're actually going to give listeners the treat of going through every single one. But before we do, I think the one thing I'd suggest is that the entire first chapter is one long exercise in straw manning the strongest critical positions. So what you'll see is Austin has either a manipulation tactic or a logical fallacy in the left column. The middle column then has like an example type argument. And I would note that Austin never actually pulls actual quotes from critics. He never pulls, a Reddit post. He never pulls a line from a Radio Free Mormon episode or a Mormon Stories episode in that section. He's, in one sense, just completely straw manning the critical position by not actually representing what real critics have said, because he puts them in quotes every time. And then his third column is like why it's a fallacy or why it's a manipulative tactic, essentially. Did you largely agree?
Because he does have straw man arguments down under his fallacies.
Yes, which is really one of the main reasons that I thought that the first chapter, just reading the first chapter, that the entire effort was parody.
Is because Code's law, right?
Because I don't understand how you can make a mistake of setting a criterion for something and then violating that criterion over and over and over again on the same page. And I'll give the listeners an example. So there's that famous quote of Elder Bednar talking about how we don't have moral agency in the church. People need to stop using the term. He says we need to stop using the term free agency. And he says, instead, once you're baptized, you have representative agency. And the criterion that Elder Bednar uses to do away with free agency is, he says, to my knowledge, the term free agency is not used in the scriptures. Well, RFM, guess what else isn't used in the scriptures? Representative agency. So to set a criterion and then violate that criterion, like in the next sentence, or as Austin does repeatedly on the same page, I'm sorry if my mind first goes to parody, but that is legitimately where my mind goes first, because I can't understand how someone can make such an obvious error repeatedly all over the place.
And right after, in the same breath, for Elder Bednar.
Right.
It is amazing. All right, so let's see here what he has to say, and I'll go to the next slide. Here's an example. Now, by the way, so everybody knows, there are 10... Hang on a second here. There are 10 manipulative tactics that he identifies, and there's a chart. And then there's like a whole ton of logical fallacies, and he's got a big, long chart after that. We are going to go into just maybe 1 or 2 of the logical fallacies from down below. But the main thing we're going to focus on for tonight's discussion is just the top 10, which are the manipulative tactics that he identifies. And here, though, as an example that Colby's going to talk about, this is something, though, from the bottom section, that lengthy section, the lengthy list of logical fallacies. And this one's called hasty generalization.
Right. And I actually went to this one Because in Austin's comment, as I mentioned earlier, he accused you of a hasty generalization in the way that you dealt with the first chapter. I don't think that's accurate. But the thing that was particularly delicious to me is as I read his example here, do you want to read that example, RFM, that he had of a hasty generalization argument?
Sure. And the example's on the far right, right?
The middle.
The middle is the example. Okay, thank you. The church's affiliated investment manager, Ensign Peak, was fined $5 million for insufficient reporting of securities owned. So the church is sketchy, period.
Okay. So here's where you were kind of giving away one of my big surprises for the listeners that I find delicious. Now we know that Austin's omission of the SEC order was from the church finances section was entirely intentional because he's talking about it right here. And one of the things I'd point out, he doesn't even have the facts right. Ensign Peak was fined $4 million. The church directly was fined $1 million because of the involvement of senior church leaders. That's the term that's used throughout the SEC order. He doesn't even have it right. But we know that this is the only place, because I downloaded the PDF and I searched, this is the only place that he talks about the SEC order in the entire thing is in this
and section. I want you to continue. This is such a brilliant point you're making. But I had said in my the last episode that I searched. There's an interior, or what do you call it, a search function, a search bar inside that document itself. And I looked up CES and it didn't come up, and it's not there. And I looked up securities for securities and exchange, didn't come up. Looked up exchange for securities and exchange, didn't come up, nothing. And I even looked up SEC and it didn't come up except as the beginning of a word like second.
Sure.
SEC, but not SEC as in the Securities and Exchange Commission.
Right.
He put this in here in such a way. Well, that's probably a coincidence, but it was that's what accounts for the fact that I didn't see it anywhere when I looked for it.
It might be because it was in a table, and sometimes searching gets messed up when it's in a table. But regardless, what it tells us is that Austin deliberately and knowingly omitted the Securities and Exchange Commission order from February 2023 from his church finances section. So again, I'm not poisoning the well here. I'm recognizing his manipulative tactics. Remember what he accused critics of doing? Telling half truths. What did we just catch him in doing? Telling a half truth. I'm sorry.
Can I? Yeah, it's so good. Can I recapitulate it as if it were my own idea? No, it's so good. No. It's just that over there, my whole thing last episode was about how in the church finances section of your own document do you not address the biggest financial scandal the church has had in its history, or at least since back to 1837. Okay. Right. And that's a long time. How do you not address it? And then, like you said, either he is intentionally not addressing it, in which case you can't trust him, or he is negligently not including it because he's not aware of it, in which case you can't trust him. That was the double bind. But now you're saying up here in chapter 1, he references it in his example. So he himself gives evidence that he knows it exists. Therefore, in chapter 5 or whatever it is on church finances, we know he's intentionally omitting it because now we know he does know about it.
Right. And even when he talks about it, he can't talk about it honestly. The church's affiliated investment manager, Ensign Peak, was $5 million. You read that freaking order, Austin, because it repeatedly deals with the fact that senior church leaders approved every single thing along the way since 1997, right until this was discovered. And the other thing I'd highlight for people who've done a deep dive on the SEC order is church audit flagged the fact that the SEC was not going to agree with the way the church and Ensign Peak were characterizing these transactions 2 separate times. And that was part of the reason that I'm wagering that was part of the reason that the church was fined $1 million directly for its involvement in the scheme. So even the way he represents it isn't accurate. He doesn't deal with it. And that's what makes it so hilarious when we read his third column of why this manipulative.
I was just reading it and I'm going, you've got to be kidding me. You got to read this. This is incredible.
It's like an absurd level of projection. So this is why, again, I come back to Poe's law and start thinking of parody. He says, we all tend to take lazy shortcuts when we encounter new information. I'm betting Austin wishes he wouldn't have taken so many lazy shortcuts when he wrote this stupid letter. And then he says, it is easier to write something off than to engage with the issue. That is true, since he doesn't deal with the largest church finances issue in the last 50 years since.
Right. After he shows that he knows about it. Oh my goodness. Yes, you're right. This must be parody.
It feels like parody. Have you ever seen The Producers by Mel Brooks?
I want to, and I know a couple of the songs.
Okay. That's what I was thinking the entire time I was reading this. This is the producers of Mormon apologetics.
In what way?
That it has to be trying to be so bad that he wants to reveal later down the road how easy it is to get Mormons to agree with something if they already believe. Because this is absurd level of engaging in the same tactics he's accusing people like you or I of engaging in.
He says it is easier to write something off than to engage with the issue. Well, yes, and you said an excellent example for us in that, Austin. And then he finishes with one or two more insights may address the concern. That's a line like he wanted to include it to fill out the paragraph box.
Yeah, it's also like this absurd idea we see so often from apologists that like, well, we can't reach a conclusion on that. We can't reach a conclusion on, the odds might be 0.001%, but we can't reach a conclusion. That's just a hasty generalization. It's absurd. No one applies that level of standard of proof in making decisions in their life in any other arena, including believing Mormons.
This is all amazing. Okay, have you said everything you want to say about this?
I have. Thank you.
This one should be framed and put up on Austin's wall. Oh, chapter 1. This looks like something I wrote up. Manipulations and logical fallacies, because that's the title of his chapter. Hence the title of our show tonight. Now, this is these are the two charts.
10, yeah.
They're actually really one chart, and these are all of the manipulation tactics. You can see that in the upper left-hand corner, or maybe you can. It says manipulation tactics. First column, second column is an example. And then third is why it is manipulative. Now, we're not going to use those. I just wanted you to see how it looks in the letter.
I'm just noticing.
What?
Half truth. Half truth is on the list. What did we just deal with? Austin telling a half truth, and yet he has half truth right on the list.
Oh, amazing. My God. Wow. Okay. Manipulation tactic number 1. Distrust in authority. That's the tactic. Assuming that any institutional structure with a hierarchy is up to no good. Now, the thing that was funny about this that I mentioned in the last show, which is that as one of his examples of a logical fallacy, he lists a very famous one, which is, what is it about authority?
Appeal to authority.
Thank you. Appeal to authority. It's appeal to authority. That's a logical fallacy, that you appeal to someone just because they're an authority figure. Now, the strange thing about the Mormon Church is that the entire governmental structure of the Mormon Church is based upon the logical fallacy of an appeal to authority. It's right there in the name. They're general authorities. And on a local level, they're local authorities. It's a remarkable thing, really. But I thought it was funny because even though he has as a logical fallacy an appeal to authority, he says it's a manipulation tactic to get someone to distrust in authority. In authority. So I don't know how that works, because it would seem like if someone is trying to get you to distrust an authority, they're actually trying to help you not commit the logical fallacy of the appeal to authority.
Yeah, I think it's another example of him completely contradicting himself on the same page, right? That's what you're pointing out. And I think what it really boils down to, and you've talked about this at length when dealing with Mormon apologetics, is Mormon apologetics is all about believing the right authority. And the right authority is someone you can trust in. Because if you look at the way he has it phrased in his why it is manipulative section, he says, this is designed to make the target distrust church leaders. First of all, I'll just comment and say, how hilarious is it that he uses the term the target, as if the church doesn't send people all over the world knocking on doors, like reaching out to people actively. If ex-Mormons reached out to Mormons the way that Mormons reach out to other people, can you imagine how loud they would be about it? Like, again, the projection is just so palpable here. And then he finishes up that white as manipulative section by saying the manipulator wins if the target believes they cannot trust the church. I'll just go ahead and address that directly. You cannot trust the church. The church has such a pattern of being dishonest over and over and over again. Why in the world would anyone believe this church? Why would anyone believe absolutely in this church? Because that's what he's asking for. He's saying that if you distrust authority, if you don't doubt your doubts, then you're, engaged in this manipulative tactic. Or if you invite people not to doubt their doubts, that you're engaged in this manipulative tactic. I just think it's absurd.
Well, I have done several podcasts detailing the evidence showing the deception of church authorities in a multitude of instances. I mean, can you say Paul H. Dunn, for crying out loud? That's low-hanging fruit. And
President Nelson and the flight of death. I mean, Landon and Rebecca just did a follow-up episode to your and Bill's excellent episode on Mormonism Live, where they, again, add some additional details, some additional color.
They had a pilot on, right?
They had I think he was an aircraft mechanic / pilot.
Okay.
His name is Jim, I remember. And he did an excellent job just breaking down that the federal regulations at the time would have absolutely required an incident report to be filed if there was a fire, the way that President Nelson described it. There is no such incident report, and there actually is a report dealing with this issue, which you and Bill brought to light. Like, the prophet of the church lies repeatedly. Like, why would it be unreasonable to tell people they cannot trust the church? You cannot trust the church. It has lied so many times. I don't even think you can count them. It's like the promise to Abraham, like the grains of sand.
Going way back.
Absolutely.
So I noticed, though, that even though you and I could come up with several instances with documentation to support the assertion and prove the claim, the example shown in this has nothing to do with any specific instance or claim or allegation. Instead, the example that's given of someone like Iago trying to sow distrust in church authority, saying, if the church donated that money, it must have been for nefarious reasons. Yeah, that's going to make somebody doubt the church. I mean, this is ridiculous. People don't have trouble with the church who have been lifelong members and faithful in going to their meetings because someone goes by and says, hey, if the church donated that money, it must have been for nefarious reasons. Get out of here. No, the problem is that they are finding out all the documentation and the real world examples of just total stories made up,
right?
Total fabrications. And President Nelson, he's at the head of the list. He's really good at that. So you have the current president of the church, the prophet of the Lord, that you can't trust him, that you shouldn't buy a used car from with his track record of honesty. So that creates a problem. But the example here is not dealing with the issue.
Yep.
You could say it's lazy.
Exactly like I said, it's just straw man of like, what did he go to ex-Mormon Reddit and pick out the worst comments instead of like actual critical art, like the best form of critical arguments? You know what that's called, Austin? That's called a straw man. You should know it because it's on your list of fallacies.
Yes, and there's other things on there too, which we'll probably come to. Yep. Manipulation tactic number 2. Remember, these are a list of 10. The myth of infallibility. Now, Austin, can you read this one? Because I've got to tell you, when I read this one, I was astonished because, well, you'll figure it out as you go along. I'll bet everybody else will be astonished too. We'll put it together.
But you called me Austin, which I take great offense to.
Austin? You're not Austin?
No, I'm not.
Austin Powers?
I will read. Do you want me to read the example?
You're supposed to go, yeah, baby, yeah.
Oh, I'm no Carrie Shirts. I can't pull that off.
No, neither can I. Okay.
Which section do you want me to read? The middle?
I'm sorry. You're Colby.
I am.
Okay, very good. As long as we've got that settled. Yeah, the myth of infallibility. Take it away, Colby.
Yeah, so he represents that as any quote or policy from church leaders in the past that does not align with what we practice or believe today. And the reason he says that's manipulative is he says it assumes something that the restoration never does, namely that God's servant should be near perfect and not succumb to popular false teachings. The formula for critics is easy. Assume church leaders are infallible. 2, show an example of fallibility.
Now, the thing that's remarkable about this is the very first thing I thought when I saw myth of infallibility was he's going to go to the old song and dance about how they're not infallible because, they can make mistakes and they could look the wrong way when they're crossing the street or something, benign like that doesn't include, like, I don't know, lying to the entire church membership. But I was surprised in that because that's not where he went. He threw me a curveball. And the curveball he threw me hit me right upside the head so bad that I can't even remember the first name of the co-host on the show. That's how bad it is, seriously. Because if I'm understanding what he's saying in this third paragraph correctly, he's given away the entire game. He's saying that the myth of infallibility, which is wrong, right? That it assumes that God's servants should be near perfect and not succumb to popular false teachings. Now, it's a bit of a confusing sentence, but I think I'm understanding him correctly when he's saying that prophets can succumb to popular false teachings. Is there any other way to understand that, Colby, that I'm missing?
No, that's exactly what he's saying. He's saying that it's an unreasonable assumption on the part of critics to expect that God's servants should not succumb to popular false teachings. And I think that's entirely consistent with the scriptural story of Abinadi just going along with the wicked priests of Noah, or Moses just joining in, worshiping the golden calf that Aaron and the people created, right? We're having too much fun.
I know. We've gone from parody to satire. That was very good. Yes, because this is remarkable. I mean, he's given away the game, really. He just wrote Snake Eyes.
Yeah. I know.
What he's saying is that it's totally acceptable in the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, for its prophets to succumb, which means to adopt popular false teachings and then teach them as if they're doctrine. Teach them from the pulpit, however you want to put it. Go ahead.
And that last piece you just said, teach them as doctrine, is the part I wanted to point out, which is that Austin is engaged so much in a straw man of what the strongest critical position here is. It's an absurd level of double pleading that he's willing to engage in here to maintain belief. Because what happens when Mormons acknowledge that past church leaders may have said or done things that do not agree with the church's current doctrine and teachings, what they seem to not recognize is that when they admit that, and they admit very grave mistakes on the part of past church leaders, that calls into question the current answers being given by the current prophets when they're saying certain things are doctrine and saying that certain things will never change. The other thing I wanted to point out is that he's acting like this is an assumption that the restoration did not give to people. And so he's entirely ignoring that most post-Mormons came by this idea completely because of what the church taught them. And I even pulled a quote to highlight this. Surely it wouldn't come from quotes like this. I believe this is
Excellent.
Harold B. Lee, where he says, keep the eyes of the mission on the leaders of the church. We will not and cannot leave you astray. And as you teach your missionaries to focus their eyes on us, teach them to never follow those who think they know more about how to administer the affairs of the church than Heavenly Father and the Lord Jesus Christ do through the priesthood leaders who have the keys to preside. I have discovered in my ministry that those who have become lost and confused are typically those who have most often forgotten that when the first presidency and the quorum of the 12 speak with a united voice, it is the voice of the Lord for that time. And I'm going to pull that quote so that I don't falsely attribute it. Oh, that was from Elder Ballard in 2014. That was only 10 years ago that he said that in his talk, Stay in the Boat and Hold On. Or there's this talk, which is the one I was thinking of. It's recounted in the Ezra Taft Benson Teachings of the Church manual, where he says, and I think it's originally attributed to Harold B. Lee saying this to Romney. My boy, you always keep your eye on the president of the church, and if he ever tells you to do anything and it is wrong, and you do it, the Lord will bless you for it. Then with a twinkle in his eye, he said, but you do not need to worry. The Lord will never let his mouthpiece lead the church astray. And so I just wanted to highlight, he's completely disagreeing with church leaders teaching this doctrine of infallibility that he's saying is just an unreasonable assumption that critics cobbled together out of their imagination. It's ridiculous.
The story has a tortured history, but I think originally it was told by Marion G. Romney when he was a bishop, and the person who is represented as being speaking there was President Grant.
You're right. It wasn't Lee, it was Grant. You're right.
It certainly has been repeated, and I think it was told by Harold B. Lee as well.
Right. And my one last little thought on this, to come back to your thought, is what do you do when the church leaders teach as doctrine things that the church today says are false doctrine? If Austin has never read the Lowry Nelson letters or the letter to Stuart Udall or to George Romney, which I searched his letter, they're not in there, so he doesn't deal with these either. In those letters, or in the First Presidency's 1949 statement on the Negro, you have church leaders explicitly teaching as doctrine things that the church today says are false doctrine. Things
They're
that they say
the D word.
Yes. And so that's, again, one of these double binds that I see for apologists is it's all fine and dandy if you want to admit these men are fallible. Of course, we know that they are. Obviously, history has demonstrated that. But then what do you do with the fact that you had church leaders teaching as doctrine things that are now false doctrine? How do you get out of that? You're left with the same problem, which is that it completely discredits their successors, the people today who are saying church members need to take strong stands, particularly on LGBTQ issues or women having access to the priesthood, and saying, no, this will never change. These things are doctrine. How do you know? Because past leaders have said things as doctrine that aren't doctrine.
Right. And that's exactly right. And that's what's going on here. And he's actually trying to maintain the position that it's okay for prophets to adopt popular false teachings and then teach them to the church as if they were doctrine. Now, he knows enough, or whoever's advising him knows enough that that's what the historical record shows.
Right.
But once you have accepted that, haven't you given away the game?
Well,
what use is a prophet
right
who can succumb to popular false teachings?
Right. That's exactly what I was going to say. I love Bill's example of a calculator when he uses this to talk about prophets. If you have a calculator that you know can be wrong, you just don't know when it will be wrong. Mm-hmm. That's a worthless calculator. Mm-hmm. What Austin's done by saying that God's servants can succumb to popular false teachings, he's made prophets completely meaningless. That's as meaningless as any other person.
And I've got to tell you, even worse than that, if you're as old as I am, you remember full well and read in church literature as well and hearing in church that this was the definition of the great apostasy and how it happened. There's the whole spiel about the priesthood getting lost because all the apostles went out to teach the gospel and got whacked before they get together and call other people into the quorum because they were as legalistic as the LDS church is today. But the other part is not just the priesthood, but how did all those false doctrines creep into the true church that Christ established according to LDS teaching? And this is the answer, always given, that they began to adopt popular false teachings. They began to become too much of the world and adopt their beliefs and their teachings. And that's how that part of the apostasy occurred. And what he's saying now is that it's not just for the great apostasy anymore. It's now in the LDS church. The great apostasy is happening right now in real time in the LDS church. And that's what Austin is actually arguing, though I don't think it's what he thinks he's arguing.
Are you saying that Austin has made the apostasy great again?
Yes. Yes. Austin 5, you have made the apostasy great again. Oh my gosh. Brilliant. Oh, wait a second. I snuck this in here.
Perfect.
Why was this? Oh, the myth of infallibility, right. And here's something with President Nelson from wasmormon.org. This is a quote from him. There is no end to the adversary's deceptions, he says. Please be prepared. Never take counsel from those who do not believe. Seek guidance from voices you can trust, from prophets, seers, and revelators, and from the whisperings of the Holy Ghost, unless they happen to have succumbed to popular false teachings.
There's another quote from President Nelson I was just thinking about when he has that exchange with the primary kids, and he asked them, "Do you know what the word prophet means?" And he says, "It means he speaks for God." And he is echoing this same concept of prophetic infallibility that's very consistent with the quotes that we read from Marion G. Romney or attributed to President Grant and to Elder Ballard. Like, there's the other problem is that Nelson doesn't believe that he's just a fallible man. Think of all the things that Wendy said about him, pulling out the paper and he's unleashed and he takes all these notes and all of this stuff. I mean, I don't know. It's just absurd to me that he would write that section when he's a member of this church. That's crazy.
I wanted a photograph of the two of them before Wendy unleashed him.
Yeah.
Oh, here's this one too. I'm sorry, I had to do this because he says, only take counsel from prophets, seers, and revelators. And that's from General Conference, October 2023. And here's this other one, which you may remember. Let me see here if I can do this, where he says, man has always been man, dogs have always been dogs, monkeys have always been monkeys. It's just the way genetics works.
And the narrator behind him said, but it wasn't the way genetics worked.
I think I've managed to get us in a constellation here that I did not intend to. So let's see what I can do with this. No, that doesn't work. That kind of works. That doesn't work. Where is this thing? I've got it. Well, okay, I hit that. That's what I hit. Hang on a second. No, okay, I'm just going through these. Okay, one at a time.
I assume you just wanted to assert dominance over me and make yourself bigger.
Okay, so why can't that work? There we go. Okay, that's the one. Well, we're definitely keeping that one in. All right, I'm not going to edit that out.
Perfect.
So, manipulation tactic number 3, the false compromise. Now, this is really funny because I've heard of a manipulation tactic. I've heard of a logical fallacy called the what is it? The false either or, the false dichotomy.
False dilemma. Yeah, false dilemma usually.
Right?
Yep.
Where you think you have to choose either the extreme here or the extreme there, and you don't consider any of the options that are actually in between, right?
Right.
What it seems like he's arguing is that manipulation tactic number 3 is trying to take someone and not make them make the false dichotomy. He calls it a false compromise, where he says it's presenting opposed narratives and then assuming, well, the truth must lie between these two extremes. Well, usually it does. I mean, right? You've got an extreme over here, you've got an extreme over there, and usually the truth is somewhere in between. Remember, that's the logical fallacy, and he has it down, doesn't he? The false dilemma, is that in his list?
I don't think he has false dilemma. I think he has it here, but I'd have to double check.
Okay, I've
also heard it called the middle ground fallacy because it's operating from this assumption, and he's right that this is an illogical assumption, that if you tell me something and Bill tells me something completely different, that the truth must be somewhere in the middle.
Oh, no. I'm talking about if it's at the absolute extreme on either side.
Yeah.
However, false compromise, presenting opposed narratives and then assuming, well, the truth must lie between these two extremities. His example is, quoting allegedly someone, somewhere, sometime, Joseph Smith said he translated the golden plates with the gift and power of God. However, he was just a treasure-seeking, peepstone-looking fraud, period, end of quote. And then he says how it works. Critics do not need their target to agree with their view. They only need the victim. Now it's the victim, not the target. At least say alleged victim. They only need the victim to reject the traditional narrative. The middle ground between truth and lies is not where the truth is. That almost
Yes, that
sounds like something
bolded
Brad Wilcox could have said.
that bolded statement is actually correct. The middle ground between truth and lies is not where the truth is, but that's not going to benefit Austin. And the bottom line of this, this manipulation tactic he accuses critics of doing is this comes back to your first comment about his line about believing the critics. Don't believe the critics. Don't believe me. Don't believe RFM. Read the information that's being provided to you. Like, I hope people go check those quotes that I read from President Grant and from President Ballard, because I want people to find this stuff on their own. That's the point, is like, we're here to share information. If that information changes people's mind and how they associate with the church, regardless of whether they stay or go, I really don't care. And I know for a fact that you don't, because we talked a lot throughout the year of my faith crisis, more behind the scenes. I just think Austin is operating from this assumption that people who leave the church really want to draw everyone out of the church. And the reality is, at least for me, that is not true. If people come to me and ask for information or ask why I'm at the place that I'm at, I'm happy to share information with them. And I have literally had conversations with people who've asked me for information where I say, I really don't know that you want me to share this information with you. You're in a place with your family or age-wise or whatever that, are you sure? And I've had people back out and say, no, that's okay. They were just trying to be nice, basically. And that's the reality. Like, I don't care if people continue going to the church. I think what bothers me is stuff like this, where he represents that people sharing the reasons they've left the church or sharing information that contradicts the church's narrative, that makes, the believer somehow the victim. Do you send out Radio Free Mormon missionaries knocking on doors all over the world? If so, I'm sad I didn't get an invite.
No, but they're working their way down your block as we speak. The thing that strikes me about this is, it's striking me right now, actually, is that if you just, the middle paragraph, the example, strike the word fraud from the end, okay? Because that's unnecessarily argumentative, right? Put a period there, end of quote. So all it says is, Joseph Smith said he translated the golden plates with the gift and power of God. However, he was a treasure-seeking peeps and a peepstone looker. How about that?
Yeah.
We'll leave the fraud off.
That's 100%
looking
accurate.
person. Now,
Right.
What part of that is not the traditional narrative?
Well, the treasure-seeking peepstone looking part.
And the church has acknowledged it in their essay on their own website.
Right.
So what's the problem? The problem is what the church is talking about here. The church has admitted all of this information. Of course, they wouldn't call it a fraud. That's a ridiculous part of his example, which nobody wrote. He wrote that. He wrote them all. It's much easier to argue with people that you can put your argument in their mouth first, and then you can address it, right?
Right.
Or put their argument in your words in their mouth. Okay. They only need the victim to reject the traditional narrative. Well, it's the church that's doing that then.
Right. And that particular example of the church not talking about the treasure-seeking history, the peepstone, really bothers me, because the church for years, I remember this in manuals all throughout my life, used the line from Emma Smith's last testimony about how Joseph could neither. We actually talked about this years ago on our first collaboration on Radio Free Mormon episodes, like 100 something.
It's a shocker. Go ahead, tell it.
Yeah. Emma, in her final testimony, talks about Joseph Smith translating the Book of Mormon by looking into the hat with the rock hour after hour. And the thing that's very problematic about that is, first, Emma Smith's last testimony is really only about a page and a half if you look at it as a PDF. And the church has incorporated into the longstanding faithful narrative that quote that Joseph could neither write nor dictate a well-worded letter from the same exact testimony. And yet, there we have Emma talking about the rock in the hat story. So, as you and I both know from dealing with court documents and attorneys, if you understand what's in a document enough to pick lines from it, then you selected which parts of the narrative you want to be true. And that's just the way it works. I'm sorry, Austin, but the church did lie about the fact that Joseph Smith, set aside fraud, like you said. To me, that's just puffery. That's just opinion. But Joseph Smith was a treasure-seeking, peepstone-looking person. That's just a fact, and the church has acknowledged that fact. It's not our fault that the church withheld that information knowingly, I would add, based on the example I just gave you, for generations. It just isn't. And you can come back and say, oh, they talked about it once in, was it The Friend that they talked about it with James Allen? Was it James Allen, his name?
I forget, but James Allen was the 1970 Improvement Era. In 1993, it was published, and President Nelson, who wasn't President Nelson, he was just Elder Nelson, then only an elder, was gave a talk to mission presidents at the time. It was published in the Ensign at the time, and he mentions a statement from one of the witnesses, probably a Whitmer, David, that mentioned that.
Right. And that's my point, is just the church now is acknowledging the treasure-seeking, peepstone-looking part of this in a way that they never did before, but that they knew about since the very beginning.
Yes. It was in their vault the whole time.
Right.
Manipulation tactic number 4. Can you read this one?
I sure can. So he calls this the big list, the Gish Gallop, named after Christian apologist Duane Gish, or proof by verbosity, an illusion of proof by the sheer mass of material provided. And his example is the CES letter. It culminates the critique of the Church of Jesus Christ's truth claims. And then his why it's manipulative section, he says that it overwhelms the reader or listener. Critics who use this big list tactic want to create the illusion that even if one concern has an answer, there are 100 more. It is the hydra of manipulation strategies. And I'll just jump in and say, this is a really stupid argument, even for Austin, because the Gish-Gallop technique is only a legitimate criticism or a legitimate accusation in a timed, structured oral debate format. Jim Bennett wrote a 400-page CES letter response, and I know because I read it during my faith crisis, okay? There's no such
I haven't
thing.
read it. What do you think of it?
I think I really like Jim Bennett. I think that Jim has openly said that his first draft, which I read, and then I read the second draft, which is the 400-something page one. I think even in his second draft, he is unnecessarily mean, nasty, and snarky, frankly. I think that changed a lot when Jim met with Jeremy. He got a lot softer. And I think Jim has, frankly, softened a lot towards Exmos like us over a lot of different issues.
I take credit for most of that.
Yeah, it was you. You are the city on the hill. But I think what it boils down to is, like, Jim has some good arguments against some arguments in the CS letter. And I'll use an example, and I know it's going to come up here in a minute. I think the Vernal Holly maps are a bad argument from critics. I just think they're stupid. And you kind of covered exactly why on Wednesday's Mormonism Live, because parallels are meaningless. Coincidences just happen. So Jim,
it's even worse when, by the way, we'll get to it here in a second, but it's even worse when you include on your map for you're comparing with Book of Mormon names of towns in New York that hadn't even come into existence as of 1829 when the Book of Mormon was dictated. Right.
So I think Jim has some good arguments against some of the stuff in the CES letter, but I think Jim would even be the first to acknowledge there are certain things that there simply are no good arguments against. Book of Abraham is one I would posit. The other one I would posit is the SEC order that we've already talked about. And the third I would posit, this is my personal issue that I left the church over, is the church's sex abuse policies. I think there is no excuse for the way that the church handles that issue. I'd point people to Heaven's Helpline, a podcast series released by the New Zealand Herald. Murray Jones did excellent investigative reporting. It's a 6-part series, mostly dealing with abuse cases in New Zealand, but it also talks about the Bisbee case, the Chelsea Goodrich case that happened here local to me, actually. And there are just there's no good answer to those arguments. There really just aren't.
No, absolutely not. Now, please, I interrupted you. Please tell us why it is that the Gish Gallop, named after Lillian Gish, is something that does not apply in written form, but only in a debate format where time is limited.
Because the idea is, in a time-structured debate, if I just list off a whole bunch of things, it is viewed as unfair or unsportsmanlike to expect whoever I'm arguing against to have to answer every single one of those little ticky-tacky objections. But in a written format, time isn't an issue. And that's my point in bringing up Jim Bennett's CS letter response, is I really cared about reading the best responses to the critical arguments at the time I was going through my faith crisis. So I took the time and read it. If Austin was too, what was the phrase he used early? Too lazy to read through the best responses, that's on him. There's no such thing as a Gish Gallop in time structured debate formats. So he's just demonstrating that he doesn't understand the manipulation tactic / fallacy that he's talking about.
Good point. I've got a question for you. Having read as much as you have of Austin Fife's Light on Truth letter, do you think it's superior or inferior to Jim Bennett's response?
Oh, it's not even close. It's vastly inferior to Jim's response.
It makes one wonder, why bother? Like, why remake King Kong if you're just going to do a crappy job of it?
Well, we'll have to ask Peter Jackson. I don't know.
Did I say that, or did I just think that?
You said, why remake King Kong if you're not going to do it better? And I said, we'll have to ask Peter Jackson. He made a crappier version of King Kong.
And Dino De Laurentiis back in the 70s.
I didn't know there was
one. Jeff Bridges and whoever the Fay Ray substitute was.
See, I always learned something about the time before I was born when I talked to you, RFM.
Oh, okay. Well, I'm glad to hear that. No, nobody's done it better than 1933, I think it was, the original. All right. Now, let's go on to the next thing. We talked about the Gish Gallop and why that doesn't make any sense whatsoever here.
Can I say one more thing about the Gish Gallop?
Oh, yeah.
I would invite any apologist, and I know Bill's done the same thing. This is why they never want to take Bill's invitation to deal with one issue all the way down to the studs. They're doing the same thing, right? They'll throw all these half evidences, NHM over in the old world, and some people will use Bat Creek Stone, or they'll use, the fact that LIDAR exists and is revealing more about South America. That's where it really comes down to developing a solid epistemology. This was my earlier comment about what was his last one? The false compromise. The way you know truth from fiction is you don't care as much about arguments. You care about evidence, Austin. And that's where, if you really cared about what's true, you'd work one of those issues, like church finances, down to the studs. You deal with the reality of the SEC order. And so my assumption is, since you're unwilling to do that, is that you don't care about what's actually true. That's the bottom line. That's the answer to this critique of Gish Galloping, which isn't accurate in the first place for the reasons we've talked about, is pick one issue. And we can talk about that one issue to the end till we really can agree on what the evidence indicates, both for and against. I'm not afraid of an exchange like that. Would you ever be afraid of an exchange like that?
No, the worst thing that could happen is that I could learn something.
Right. Great point.
All right. Well, let's go to number 5. Great point that you made too. Number 5, the half-truth. Oh, can I take this one, Colby?
Whoopsies.
Whoops. Ruh-roh, Raggy. This is the half-truth. This is a manipulation tactic when someone tells you a half-truth. It's called mixing truth with deceit to confuse the issue. That's how he defines it. Here's his example. Pay attention, please. The CES letter seeks to explain how Joseph Smith came up with so many unique place names in the Book of Mormon. A table, now this is the vernal Holly map that we were mentioning earlier. A table lists place names and potential candidates in and around upstate New York. Candidates means candidates for places, okay, that have names similar to the Book of Mormon in a place that might match a sort of geography for the Book of Mormon. That's what the vernal Holly map is about, okay? The idea is not a half-truth. It is more like a 10th truth. Whoa, those are fighting words there, Mr. Fife. Most modern cities on the list did not exist until after the publication of the Book of Mormon. And this was, of course, one of the objections to the vernal Holly map, which has been around for quite a while, that whoever put it together, who I'm guessing maybe his first name was Vernal, possibly last name Holly, what he did was he tried to put a kind of I'm almost saying half-assed geography of the Book of Mormon in upstate New York, around where Joseph Smith lived. And maybe it works and maybe it doesn't. But the main point of it is that it lists in locations different cities that either bear the same name as cities in the Book of Mormon, with, the implication is that they're all structured and distance and located in the same place in the same geography.
Right.
But in some that are close, right, or suggestive of. And the idea being Joseph Smith just looked around, here's the geography and here's the names of the cities, and I'll change a couple, okay, but not a lot. The eternal objection to this was that whereas some of the cities did exist when Joseph Smith, maybe townships, when Joseph Smith was alive, 1829 being the key date, he's dictating the Book of Mormon, the city or town has to be there before 1829. Otherwise, it's not fair to include it in a map that's trying to show connections to the Book of Mormon, right? Well, in Vernal Hawley's original map, he had cities in there that did not exist until after 1829, which drew, and justifiably so, the ire of the apologists. And this is what he's talking about here. So I'm going to read it again really quick, okay?
Yeah, please.
Now you can understand what he's talking about. The CES letter seeks to explain how Joseph Smith came up with so many unique place names in the Book of Mormon. A table, it's a map, lists place names and potential candidates in and around upstate New York. The idea is not a half-truth. It is more like a 10th truth. Most modern cities on that list did not exist until after the publication of the Book of Mormon. Okay. And he concludes by saying a half-truth is still a lie at its core. I wonder if those words will come back to bite Austin. What do you think, Hope?
He needs to take his own medicine there.
A half-truth is still a lie at its core. It is more destructive than a lie because a half-truth requires untangling the lie from the truth.
Can I say just one word about that before you touch on the map itself?
Yes.
That last line is the reason that so many people struggle through a faith crisis, because he's right. It is more destructive to untangle a bunch of half-truths and things that you were taught. I know that you were a convert. I was born in the church. That's one of the things that makes it so painful. And I'll actually say, I think that part, that faith deconstruction is harder on people who were raised in the church, because there was never a version of me that existed without the church. So untangling myself from things that I know, and I'm not saying all the things. There are many things the church teaches. Focus on family. Great. I think for the most part, the word of wisdom, the way it's interpreted today, I always laugh at the fact that the word of wisdom in the freaking scripture starts with, it's not a commandment, and the church has made it a commandment. Like, how much more obvious can you make it? But my point is, taking care of your body, not drinking too much, not engaging in drugs, those are not bad things. And that's one of the things that's so painful about a faith crisis, is you essentially have to pick apart pieces of you until you're not even sure who you are. At least that was my experience. Now, I'm happy to say, with the help of, good friends, my family, I'm so happy with where my life is at today. I wouldn't have believed 2 years ago that I could be so happy, but Austin's right. Half-truths are that damaging. And that's exactly what people are going through when they talk about the pain of a faith crisis. They're talking about the pain of having to unravel things that they believe their whole life that are so core to them that it's incredibly damaging. And that's one of the reasons that the cognitive dissonance is so strongly telling you, and the confirmation bias is so strongly telling you just not to open that door, not to look in that box, because it's so difficult to get to that level where you essentially have to allow your ego, this version of you that's existed, to die. You have to. That's what it felt like to me.
Okay, good points. Rehearsing this before we get to the next, this is now we're going to address a few other slides that I found and did some research to respond to this allegation that he's made against the CES letter, because it turns out that this is not true. It seems to be a half-truth, in spite of what I said about the Vernon Hawley letter.
So you're saying that his half-truth example is itself a half-truth?
Yes, exactly. It's a half-assed half-truth.
That is a chef's kiss, no notes there, Austin.
Thank you. Well, over here on the left, you have Book of Mormon geography. And this is Joseph Smith's geography. I think these were both by Vernal Hawley. Anyway, he has Joseph Smith's geography with Joseph Smith's names. And over here on the right, we have the same geography, except I probably had it backward. The right is Lake Erie and Lake Ontario, which clues me into this was in Joseph Smith's time. Over here on the left, Sea West, Sea East, narrow neck going between them. You see that?
Mhm.
And then some names like Jacob Bugath.
This will be just so stimulating for the audio listeners.
Oh, yeah. And Jacobsburg. That corresponds to Jacobsburg in Joseph Smith's day. And then there's Kishkumen. Was Kishkumen a place?
It was a person.
I know it was a person. Well,
I don't think
maybe
it
it's
was a
too.
place.
I don't know. Maybe that's where he hung out in the summers. But here's Kishkumen, and they're trying to locate or analogize it to Kishkimitas. I think that's what it is. Okay, so there's a few of them. Oh, Oneida is a good one because Oneida is here on right next to the Sea East, and over here in Joseph Smith's day is a city in the same location, and it's called Oneida. That's a pretty good match. Just spelled different, pronounced the same. Okay, so here's the thing, though. Here's the thing. This is from the current edition of the CES letter. That's where I culled this from. This is the table that Austin Fife is talking about. The problem is, and what I was very glad to see, I'll be frank with you, is that a long time ago, when this came out years ago, and of course, Jeremy Reynolds, the author, put it open to criticisms or additional information, whatever. And this is one of the criticisms he got, was that some of these cities were there after 1829. So what he did was he went in and removed all the cities that did not exist until 1829. This is not the original Vernal Hawley map. This is the Vernal Hawley map as it appears in the CES letter, modified to respond to the legitimate objection about the cities. They had to have existed in 1829, and this reflects those cities that did exist. Here's how I found some of this. Now, this is from a location. It looks like it's on Reddit.
Yeah, the ex-Mormon Reddit.
Yes, and this may have appeared. I think I got it out of the CES letter, but it was removed from there. And it says, "Hey guys," this is from, by the way, Jeremy Reynolds, I believe.
Right.
"Hey guys, I'm about 90 to 95%. By the way, it's 3 years ago, even on this version of it. You can see it in the upper middle, 3 years ago. Hey guys, I'm about 90 to 95% on removing the entire Book of Mormon geography / Vernal Hawley maps out of the CES letter, but I wanted to gather your thoughts and assessment." So he's putting it out there to everybody. "In the original CES letter, there were errors contained in Hawley's maps that I fixed and revised in a later version of the CES letter. Here's my back and forth on the maps with Fair Mormon. Even though the maps and list have been updated and corrected, I believe that it's the weakest part of the CES letter." I would agree. The evidence to me is meh and not strong enough for my taste. The only way I'd probably keep it in the CES letter is with a disclaimer of some sort, basically saying something to the effect of, "Vernal Hawley's maps and parallels are controversial. This information is not incorrect, but it's not strong either. Here are resources for further research." Then he said, "My current plan is to remove it, and in the CES letter updates page, explain this removal and why I removed it. Thoughts? Keep, remove, why?" Well, apparently he ended up deciding not to remove it, but to keep it, but remove the cities that did not exist after 1829. This was from his page. And this is also from the CES letter, where apparently Dustin, an apologist, who is most likely the guy who was my very best friend back in college in the 1980s for a number of years, Dustin says, now this is once again on the CES letter page. You can go find it. It's on the internet.
Is this the Dusty Smith?
I think so.
Okay.
Maybe it's not. Maybe it'd be Dusty, but maybe he called him Dustin. I don't know another Dustin. Do you know another Dustin?
I do, but I seriously doubt it's the Dustin I know.
Dustin Hoffman. Several of the towns on this author's list were not even in existence at the printing of the Book of Mormon. Other locations were remote villages hundreds of miles away in places like Canada, hardly the land of Joseph's youth. Verdict: debunked. Jeremy's response. This was true in the original CES letter that I wrote 4 years ago, which I immediately corrected when the errors came to my attention. It is not true for the updated and revised CES letter today. So that's a false and misleading claim and statement from Dustin. I have already done a thorough line-by-line detailed response and rebuttal on this. I have already gone through this with Fair Mormon, and I revised the list based on the evidence. You can find my response here, and there's a link. So we've got a situation here, before we go to number 6, where all of this is found on the CES letter page. It was a big deal. He went through it with Fair Mormon. It was all public. And yet here we have Mr. Half-Truth himself, Austin Fife, claiming as an example of a half-truth that the CES letter uses unedited Vernon Holly maps.
And I think what this clearly shows is I don't agree with the other listener who had emailed you and said, oh, I think an apologetic group is behind this, obviously, because I think it's really bad. I think a group of people could have done a much better job. But what it does show is that Austin is very clearly just recycling apologetics from someone else, because to make a mistake like that shows he didn't go to the CES letter website. And one of the things I'd highlight is, do you remember a few weeks ago, I called you on a Thursday. I just remember because it was the day after Mormonism Live. And I said, hey, I want to talk to you about something you talked about in the episode last night. And the first thing you said to me was, oh, great. What did I get wrong? And I know that, you were kind of joking, but it's because you've had discussions like that with me or other people where you've then done a correction in a later episode to say, hey, I got this like minor detail wrong. And here we see Jeremy engaging in the same behavior where people pointed out to him this mistake that he had in his original draft, and he changed it and made it more accurate. I would put quite a bit of money that we will not see a amendment to the Light and Truth letter to fix this error, this obvious error, or any of the other obvious errors that we've pointed out. And I think people should wonder why. Why are the critics so willing to engage in fixing their arguments and correcting when they've made a misstatement? But apologists seem to have absolutely no consequences for telling very obvious, misleading, faith-affirming narratives.
I think evidence may be more important to one side than the other.
I would agree.
All right.
This is a great find, RFM. And I can't believe that it's in his half-truth itself. Like, the irony of that is so delicious to me.
I'm not the one who wrote a response to the freaking CES letter. One would expect that if one were to write a response, one would read the CES letter and not know about this here. I didn't know about it. I just thought, is that true? Does the CES letter do that? That would be disappointing. And I went back and the CES letter didn't do that.
Right. Wow. Unbelievable.
Manipulation tactic number 6. I've been talking for a while. Could you take this one?
Sure. So this is his manipulation tactic of presentism, assuming historical figures see the world in the same way that a person would today, judging the past by today's standards. And then his example is church leaders phased in the word of wisdom from its 1833 introduction to 1921. 1833, is that accurate? That time?
I think so.
Okay. That was when it became required for a temple recommend. Critics point out that the early church leaders did not adhere to the word of wisdom as we know it today. That is by far the weakest criticism, like one of the weakest criticisms I could think that apologists usually claim presentism on.
Well,
they're not going to talk
something
about. Yeah, please.
He's giving an example of the word of wisdom, but we all know what he's talking about. He's talking about plural marriage. He's talking about polygamy. Yeah. He just can't bring it up.
He doesn't want to talk about it's unsavory. So his example of why, or I'm sorry, his description of why it's a manipulative tactic.
By the way, that has nothing to do with presentism.
Right. That's holding Mormonism to its own standard.
What he's saying is presentism means if you expect the Mormon church to be the same today as it was initially.
Well, it's judging past behavior by today's morality. It would basically be a criticism like Brigham Young accepted slaves on behalf of the church. True, by the way, he did as tithing. That would be presentism, I think.
Yes, it would also be illegal today. But what I'm suggesting is that he calls it presentism, which is a legitimate,
Right.
it's actually a logical fallacy. He wants to call it a manipulation tactic anyway. And he defines it, I think, correctly. But the example he gives doesn't follow
Isn't one.
the
Right.
definition.
Right.
The definition
Right.
is judging moral standards, but what he's trying to use it is to say presentism means it's a manipulation tactic. It's a logical fallacy if you think the church today has to be the same as it used to be, which
Right.
means that what he has done is he's found a way. Congratulations, by the way. What he's done is he's found a way to say presentism means that whatever the church teaches today is the truth, because we can't judge it by what was said before.
And that would beg the question in my mind of, but what about the expectation that church leaders, he's saying that it's an unreasonable expectation to not expect church leaders to succumb to the incorrect beliefs in the world. These two things are in complete contradiction.
Yes, they are. They absolutely are. And all he wants to do is try and give the leaders of the church a buy on anything, any doctrine, any ordinance, any temple endowment, anything that they want to change over time. There is nothing that's set in stone now in this church. It's become, what was the passage? Was it Ephesians chapter 4? Something about he gave some apostles and prophets and some prophets, some evangelists and pastors, et cetera, for the work of the ministry, for the perfecting of the body of the Christ, and body of Christ, something else, that we henceforth be no more tossed to and fro.
Mm-hmm.
Remember that whole part?
Yeah, absolutely.
Like, the wind and the waves and everything, and every wind of false doctrine.
Right.
Whereby, talking about Satan and Eliath wait to deceive.
Yep.
This is where we are now in this church. If he is to be believed or credited that actually is. This is Austin Fife's version of the church. There are no anchors. There's nothing tethering it. It will go wherever the wind blows. And by wind, I mean whoever happens to live the longest of the top 15 at any given time.
What that shows is how damning the evidence is, because Austin's working from this assumption, like Carrie Muhlestein, that the church is true. And then he's making an argument based on the evidence as it is. So that's the point, is that the evidence as it is requires him to make both of these admissions at the same time, on the same page, in the same list, that are completely contradictory. And I'll just really quickly, there are three laws of logic that really undergird the reason that logical fallacies are a problem, right? There's the law of identity, the law of non-contradiction, and the law of the excluded middle. The real simple way I would explain this, the basics of critical thinking, is something is what it is, it isn't what it isn't, and it can't be both at the same time. Yet Austin's apologetics run headlong into the foundational things of epistemology, the foundational keys of understanding epistemology, because he's openly espousing completely contradictory apologetics. That's what the evidence dictates, is that Mormonism is logically inconsistent and therefore absurd.
Very good. Usually you do this on separate days or separate weeks or separate conferences. You don't put them on the same page, because when you don't put them right together, then it's harder to catch on that you're making inconsistent arguments. You got to make one argument here for this issue, but you got to make another argument over here for this issue. The arguments themselves are inconsistent. That's why you don't want to put them on the same page. And this is the perils of what happens when you do.
Right. Your work is viewed as a parody.
Can you read his whatever that third thing is? Because
sure can.
It's confusing to me.
Yep. Well, his example is a stupid one, but I'll read the rest of it. He says, judging people in the past based on today's standards is popular, but misleading. Imagine getting speeding tickets for driving 35 in a 25 mile per hour zone in your neighborhood, except that the speed limit was only recently changed from 35 to 25. If critics lived at the same time as the people they criticize, they would believe and act similar or worse. Anything from 200 years ago seems weird without historical and cultural context. The funny thing about this example is, if the speed limit was recently changed from 35 to 25, do you know what the speed limit is, Austin? The speed limit is 25. You're just saying, I committed a crime, but not a crime. I committed an infraction, but I wouldn't have committed an infraction if I lived 2 weeks ago. That's still committing an infraction. This is one of the weirdest arguments. If things were different, things would have been different. That's what he's saying. That's the effect of what he's saying. It's a tautology.
And it's interesting when he says he's trying to use this presentism and he's trying to use it on polygamy. And he gives himself away here. If critics lived at the same time as the people they criticize, they would believe and act similarly or worse. Why is it or worse? Is there something he's talking about that appears immoral from this perspective in time? Because, of course, he's talking about plural marriage.
Right.
That doesn't fit with the word of wisdom, I don't think.
It's just more projection, too. Like the or worse is completely unnecessary. And it's also that entire sentence is just an assertion without any evidence. If critics lived at the same time as the people they criticize, they would believe and act similarly or worse. Like, prove it. How in the world could you even... This, again, comes back to your first episode. Why in the world would I believe the words of someone who's so willing to attest things that they cannot possibly know? He cannot possibly know that. He doesn't know you or I or how we would act. And to be fair, neither do I. But I'm not the one making an assertion that I do know that I would act better than Joseph Smith. I feel pretty confident I would, because I think the floor is set pretty low there. But he's just so willing to make these assertions that he has absolutely no evidence or no reason to believe. And that's where I would just point to the epistemological razor that's attributed to Christopher Hitchens, Hitchens razor, that which can be asserted without evidence can also be dismissed without evidence. We have no reason to even talk about stuff like this.
And I like the last line as well. Anything from 200 years ago seems weird without historical and cultural context. What he's talking about, 200, he's talking about the early church.
Yeah.
Come on. So anything from early church time seems weird. So Joseph Smith's, family being a farmer, trying to raise crops, clearing the ground, that seems weird, because what farmer would do that today? No, 95% of everything they did was completely comprehensible today. And the rest of it that's not comprehensible today, maybe things that have changed, like in the law. Like people could just go swear out a criminal complaint against somebody and hand it to the sheriff, and they'd go and arrest them. You didn't have a prosecuting attorney's office as some sort of, what would you call it, some kind of barrier or clearinghouse, or hopefully somebody to look at this a little less impartially or more impartially.
Right.
But we understand that, right? I mean, that's not like it's weird. It was just a little different.
Right.
What he's trying to say is the stuff that, let's just talk about polygamy, okay? It doesn't make any difference what context you put polygamy in. Yeah, it's 200 years ago. It's the United States of America. It was weird. It was weird, Austin. With historical context, it was weird.
Right.
It was worse than weird. It was immoral.
It was one of the reasons.
Context, even with the cultural context, it was weird and it was immoral.
Well, it was one of the reasons.
Get away from that. I'm so sorry, but people who have these feelings about polygamy and Joseph Smith practicing it that are negative, which I think they should be, and I think it's a good sign if you have a bad feeling about it. But now they're trying to say either Joseph Smith didn't practice polygamy at all, or he did, but it was 200 years ago and it was totally different. We can't understand. It seemed weird. Everything seemed weird. That's where he goes way over the line in making an argument that itself is not a good argument at its outset.
Right. And it comes back to the double bind we talked about with the myth of infallibility, right? Joseph Smith, supposedly, if you believe the Doctrine and Covenants, Joseph Smith received very specific direction. I think it's is it 101 that has all the details of how much you can buy a share in the Nauvoo house for?
I'm not sure. I'm going to guess 124.
I think it is 124. You're right, actually. I looked at it the other day.
Well, it's lucky guess then.
But Joseph Smith can receive that level of specificity of revelation, supposedly. And yet we're supposed to believe, because really what he's saying is he's going back to his idea that prophets can buy into popular mistakes from the time period they live in. That's part and parcel of what he's arguing here. I'm sorry, it just doesn't work that way. Or if it does work that way, then I have no reason, no meaning from prophets who can fall prey to the false conceptions of the time period that they live in. That's the reality, is if you buy his arguments, there's no value proposition of prophets that can make mistakes like that.
And the amazing thing is I just saw an interview, which I'm not going to go into detail about who it is or where it was, but I just want to say that there is a person who's a historian with the church. He's probably with Fair Mormon. It's been Spackman. Right after I said I wouldn't go into detail, who is taking the position that this is true and that the church is changing to reflect this. And then he's asked the obvious question from a faithful person saying, so people wonder, why do we need prophets? What makes them any different from anybody else? And he says, well, because these are the people that are chosen. The prophet, if God's ever got something to say when he wakes up from his 6,000 year nap, if he's ever got something to say to this prophet, to the world, it'll go through this guy. Okay. And the second thing is, they have the priesthood keys, right? The priesthood keys. So the guys that have an established, let me back up and say, which we have no evidence of except their say so.
Right.
They say we have keys. We can't see them. We see them acting in ways that are very inconsistent with people who profess to have keys from Jesus Christ. And the problem is that they lie so damn much, we can't trust them. So how can we take the word of someone that they have the keys of the priesthood that are necessary for you to get saved and exalted, when at the same time we can't trust them to buy a used car?
Yep. They lie about spiritual experiences too. I'm not sure if you've read Matt Harris's new book, Second Class Saints, or listened to
I have read it cover to cover, by the way.
Okay.
Excellent book.
One of the things he highlights is that Boyd Packer and one other apostle basically got a talking to from Spencer W. Kimball because they were representing out at like stake meetings, and I think it was McConkie actually.
There were two apostles about the spiritual woo-woo stuff that had happened during the meeting, which never happened.
Right. They were essentially claiming that the revelation, I'm going to put that in air quotes, the revelation that lifted the priesthood ban that President Kimball received, they were out representing that it was essentially like a day of Pentecost. We saw angels, we saw the Lord, we saw all of these things. And Spencer W. Kimball literally had to tell them, stop doing this. Stop saying stuff happened that didn't happen. And Matt Harris details that looking directly at Spencer W. Kimball's papers and journal. And I only highlight that because we gave a couple of examples of leaders lying, but that's a revelation, like a revelation or a official declaration that's right in the freaking scriptures. And these men were willing to lie about it. Boyd K. Packer was an apostle for most of my life, and he was lying about spiritual things. So it comes back to your comment about keys. Why in the world would I believe Boyd Packer's claim to have any keys when I know that Boyd Packer is willing to lie about revelation and about faith affirming experiences? I know that explicitly.
I think it was surprising to me. It was one of the most surprising things that I had not heard before. There were a number of them, but this was one of them.
Right.
To me, of course, I knew them in terms of contemporary with them in my membership of the church and looked up to them and respected them as a TBM. But to have them going out there and doing that, I suppose somebody could say, well, maybe they saw it and other people didn't. However, that's not what Spencer Kimball did. He didn't say, okay, well, maybe you saw it, nobody else did. He said, knock it the hell off.
Right.
Which, unfortunately, has the effect of making me cast my mind back to 1836 in April in Kirtland, Ohio.
Right.
And the dedication of the Kirtland Temple. And all the people who are leaving recordings of seeing angels and the rushing mighty wind and all the spiritual manifestations.
Right.
Why should I think they weren't just making it up too?
And same thing with the transfiguration of Brigham Young, which you covered in your episode, Apostolic Coup d'etat, right? It was the same thing. And that's one of the things I think that's so apparent. Once you see it, you can never unsee it, is that there is this improvisational, collaborative element that goes into spiritual experiences that once you see it, you can never unsee it. And I had that experience personally in the middle of my faith crisis. I had this really spiritual experience on my mission that I would testify of regularly, where I had this investigator that claimed to be able to see spirits, and not in like a spooky way. It was she came off as very sane, very credible. And when my companion and I went home that night, we had this experience where we felt like some missionaries have the same story, where they feel like they're attacked by some type of dark or evil presence. And the thing that was so interesting to me is that I had been testifying of this experience and how powerful it was for years, for like a decade. And then I went back during my faith crisis to my mission journal and read in my own handwriting what had actually happened that night. And it was so much less miraculous than I
Really?
had. Yes, I had added to that experience over time. And I had I could very clearly see that when I went back to my journal. I actually wanted to call and talk about it on the After Dark on Halloween, but I couldn't. But yeah, I had this
You can do
experience
it
where I
this
could
Friday if you want. But of course, as I'm saying this, we're recording this on Thursday night. Friday is tomorrow night. This will be airing on Saturday. So that will make no sense.
Yeah, I'll just air it here. But yeah, I looked in my journal and I could very clearly see in my own handwriting that really what happened is we went home, we felt this heaviness from having some difficult conversations with this investigator. We prayed, we felt comforted, and we went to bed. But in my mind and over time, and probably in talking with that companion over, the coming weeks, we had built this experience into something so much more significant than it really was when I looked at the record that I wrote that night. And I remember very specifically going and writing it that night so that I wouldn't forget. It's a very interesting experience to see that the more we understand about our brain and the way our brain processes memories, we know that that's the way it happens, that I wasn't trying to lie to myself, but I was. And once you understand that, you have to engage constantly in these reality checking tools. That's why understanding critical thinking and logical fallacies is important, because it's a way we can check reality. We can check whether we've been captured by some huckster. One of my favorite things I'll have is when I'll have someone I look up to and respect and agree with largely. I'll use an example of you or other people I listen to, and I'll hit a point where I disagree with them. I like finding that, because you know what that signals to me? I follow evidence. I don't just listen to.
You don't just believe the critics.
I don't just believe the critics.
I knew I could get this back to this Light on Truth letter. Oh my gosh. Well, thank you. I thought that was really very interesting. Let me put back up the slide.
Should we go to 7? Okay. You want me to read this
Manipulation
one?
tactic number 7, MT7. Oh yes, quote mining, please.
Quote mining. So this one, I found something interesting. So mining for unflattering quotes made in the past, a meme on social media by a critic. My wife has borne to me 15 children. Anything short of this would have been less than her duty and privilege. George F. Richards, Relief Society magazine, July 1916. It is so this is why he thinks quote mining is manipulative. It is disingenuous, scouring a target's social media feeds to find anything damaging is similar. Often these quotes lack context or fall into the presentism category. Let's just roll right into it. Will you go to the next slide? Because
absolutely.
Guess what we caught Mr. Fife doing on that same page. So right under his heading of manipulation tactics and fallacies, he's got the 2 quotes that people can see on their screen. One is a quote from John DeLynn where he snipped it from an episode of Mormon Stories, and the other is an episode of Mormon Stories featuring Jeremy Runnels, if I remember correctly, where he's taken a quote from Jeremy Runnels out of context or yanked it out of context. It's just hilarious that he's engaging in the same exact tactics that he calls bad faith tactics that allow him to completely write off all critics of the church on the same page. Like, how you make mistakes like this is just astounding to me.
If you had a student who made mistakes like this in a paper that was required for class and you were grading it, what would you do?
Oh, you're going to call me on the carpet for that because I talked to you about this.
Yes.
I wouldn't fail the student because I'm a nice adjunct professor. But what I would do is I would ask the student to stay after and explain, hey, this is the type of very obvious problematic deficiency that people will use to write off every single thing you've said, the rest of it. And you highlighted this very well, I think, in your first episode. You said, once I've caught someone like this engaged in deception or engaged in incompetence to this level, regardless of which it is, I now know I have to go double check everything they've said. So why even read what they have to say? That's what it boils down to. Is it's a complete integrity, and it's a complete signal that the person isn't engaging in good faith, or they're incapable of engaging in good faith. Because I don't want to say that this mistake was intentional on Austin's part. I know the other one I highlighted earlier was, but if it's incompetence, it doesn't matter. The end result is still the same, that you can't trust what's coming out of this individual.
It's one thing to have a strong argument. That's what we all hope for. It's one thing to have a mediocre argument. It's one thing to have a bad argument, but it's another thing entirely to have a bad argument and also undercut your own argument and show why it's so bad.
Right. On the same page.
Yes, on the same page.
This is that one. That mistake was the one that made me think it was parody. I couldn't.
And it's not just these two quotes; it's throughout every single one of these middle paragraphs that we've been talking about in quotation marks. They're supposed to be quote mined as well.
Right.
Did he actually do it in this example? No, it was from George F. Richards.
Right.
Okay. So, but he does it everywhere else.
Right.
All right. Manipulation tactic number 8: meat before milk. We've all heard that before, haven't we? Presenting complicated issues without first establishing the fundamental building blocks for understanding. So, of course, it's the critic's job to explain why these weird teachings make sense. An example, by the way, this is the fun part. This is something that always bothered me as an apologist, because Jesus and Satan being spirit brothers sounds really crazy until you understand that everybody is spirit children of Heavenly Father who were propagated by a whole lot of sex on their part. All billions and billions of us. See, that doesn't sound as weird at all. However, one of his examples is Mormons believe they will all have their own planet. What's he talking about? Has he not got the memo? Austin, did you not get the memo? We're not going to get our own planet.
That was in the
That's
national
not even
news.
meat.
Yeah.
That's spoiled meat. That's tainted meat, Austin. We don't get our own planet. The church said so on their own news page quite a number of years ago. I think it was around 10 years ago.
Yeah.
It says, do Mormons believe they will get their own planet? Answer, no. In a story. Quit asking us. So not only does Austin not know what's in the CES letter, he doesn't even know what his own church is teaching. But we have to give him a pass on that, because they do teach it in their manuals that the members are supposed to read. But in the newsroom section that's made to be read by the Gentiles, they have a different message. And that's where they said, Mormons do not believe that they will get their own planet. So that's not meat anymore. Mormons believe, this is his second example, Mormons believe that only they will get into heaven. Okay, I understand it's put in a bit of an argumentative way. But, I mean, what is wrong with that? What's the problem? Isn't that the only reason you go through everything you have to go through being a Mormon? Is if you're the only one who gets into heaven? Because if you could do something else in some other religion, something maybe less strenuous, less life-draining, then that's what I'd choose.
Is that even accurate Mormon doctrine because of DNC 131?
I think it is, and I know what you're going to, but I think I know where you're going to. You can tell me what you're going to if you want.
Oh,
However,
I'm talking about the revelation that Joseph received because of his brother Alvin.
His brother Alvin.
Because of Alvin's death, all who would have received, all who.
Oh, I'm sorry, you said 131. Maybe you meant 137.
Is that what I'm sorry? 137.
I think it's 137. Okay. You can look it up if you want.
I trust you.
Don't. I don't trust myself. Maybe I should look up 124 while I'm at it. You just go ahead. But say whatever it is you want to say about Alvin, and I'll look it up.
Honestly, I really don't have a lot to add to this one. I think milk before meat. I actually view milk before meat is an insane manipulation tactic. So he's saying meat before milk by teaching people the conclusion. So I'll read his why it's manipulative section and I'll share my thoughts real quick while you look that up. He says critics who use this tactic either one, do not understand the issue, or more likely two, understand it but know that jumping to the conclusion first will lead people to avoid engaging the church's sincere claims. I would actually say that milk before meat is a form of manipulation tactic if the meat never comes. And I think that's one of the things that's very clear engaging in Mormonism. Like, the church has literally walked away from even having separate manuals for adults and children. All of them now have the same second hour manual. Like, you're literally being taught the same lessons your entire life, the same basics, never really
Cradle to grave.
Yep. Never really getting to any of this meat.
Okay. Well, I will tell you that it's 137.
I figured.
I agree. And also, this ends up playing into one of his themes, which he mentions elsewhere. Maybe we'll get to it, maybe we won't, where he puts out the canard that if you're having trouble with church history, it's because you don't know enough about church history. And if you knew enough about church history, if you learned enough, you'd realize that it doesn't make any difference, that it's not a problem at all. But that is meat before milk. That's like the carrot when you're riding the donkey and you have the carrot on the stick and you keep that donkey going mile after mile after mile with the promise of that carrot, which he's never going to get, because no matter how far he goes or how fast he goes, it's always going to be held just out of his reach. You never get to the meat in the Mormon church. That is a psychological ploy to keep you going. That's my take on it anyway.
Yeah, I completely agree.
All right. Manipulation tactic number 9, naturalist assumptions. This is an interesting one. Assuming no supernatural or spiritual forces are at play in the universe. In other words, if you assume that everything that happens is natural, not supernatural.
Mm-hmm.
As
this
an
would
example,
specifically be, I'll just point out, this would specifically be philosophical naturalism. It's someone saying affirmatively, there's no such thing as supernatural or spiritual forces. And that would be completely separate from the idea of methodological naturalism, which is, I've seen no good evidence to believe in a supernatural or spiritual force. I would if there were evidence. Maybe I'm giving away what I think of this one, but that's one of the fatal flaws of what he's saying here.
Yes, very good. I like it. I like where you're going with that. He now quotes in some kind of mixed up fashion, I think, Sterling McMurrin, who was the original person who said angels don't appear to men to give them golden plates. I think what he said was angels don't give gold plates to farm boys. Maybe it was like that. At any rate, it's a naturalistic assumption, right? Then he says critics who have naturalistic assumptions are closed-minded by definition. They are limited in the amount of bullshit they will believe. No, I'm sorry. Wait a second. He says, he didn't say that. He said they are limited in their pursuit of truth. Well, I guess
might
it's
as
kind
well
of the same
have.
thing. Yeah.
He might as well have. Yes.
We are limited. Those with naturalistic assumptions, which I am largely, by the way.
As am I.
I think there's stuff out there that's probably natural that we maybe can't see or understand the influence of exactly yet.
Sure.
But still, they are limited in their pursuit of truth. Eliminating supernatural forces from the universe closes off an entire dimension of truth. This is like Mulder down at the basement of the FBI with a poster up on his wall. The truth is out there.
Yeah. And look at him saying that critics who have a naturalistic assumption, so he's calling that an assumption, bringing to the table the assumption that you only believe in the things that have been demonstrated to exist. He's saying the absence of that closes off an entire dimension of truth. Which is the bigger assumption? Only believing in the things that have been demonstrated to exist, or saying that there's an entire dimension of truth in some unseen, undemonstratable, unfalsifiable realm that cannot be detected? This is ridiculous. I think this is one of the dumbest arguments that the letter makes. And what it is, the entire thing is a fallacious shift of the burden of proof. We're not assuming that there are no spiritual forces at play by simply observing that no supernatural or spiritual claim has ever met a legitimate standard of proof. The entire reason we discuss epistemology is to recognize that we don't believe things just because. We should believe things for good reasons. This is the entire point of Bertrand Russell's famous teapot analogy or experiment, where he says, if I were to suggest that between the Earth and Mars, there is a teapot revolving around the sun in an elliptical orbit, nobody would be able to disprove my assertion, provided I were careful to add that the teapot is too small to be revealed even by our most powerful telescopes. But if I were to go on and say that, since my assertion cannot be disproved, it is intolerable presumption on the part of human reason to doubt it, I should rightly be thought to be talking nonsense. If, however, the existence of such a teapot were affirmed in ancient books, taught as sacred truth every Sunday, and instilled into the minds of children at school, hesitation to believe in its existence would become the mark of eccentricity and entitle the doubter to the attentions of the psychiatrist in an enlightened age or of the inquisitor in an earlier time.
I don't think I've heard the entire quote. That's great. That's absolutely spot on. Wow.
It comes from his 1952 essay, Is There a God? And I think he nails it. He nails where the burden of proof lies. It lies on people making affirmative claims. If you're claiming there's an entire dimension of truth in this supernatural or spiritual force, it should be able to be demonstrated, because real things can be demonstrated.
And I've got to tell you that the way this is presented, it looks to me like Austin Fife wants to have supernatural occurrences. By the way, specifically, Mormon supernatural occurrences, first vision supernatural occurrences, angel Moroni showing up, all of those supernatural occurrences. Those are the ones he's arguing for, nobody else's. But it looks like he wants that to be on the table as an equal opportunity or equal option with Joseph Smith made up the Book of Mormon on his own.
Right. But he'll immediately discount Muhammad riding on a winged horse and splitting the moon in twain, or the miracle at Fatima. That's right. It's entirely special pleading. It's, I get to assume my stuff is true, but I don't believe those other miracles.
Right.
If you pick up one end of the stick, you got to pick up the other, Austin.
And once you have a tiger by the end of the tail, you don't let go. Now, what he's feeling he's being held by the tail. And because we're holding him to what can be demonstrated, he wants to be able to be let go, so he can hide in the jungle of supernatural forces, which are by their very definition unfalsifiable. So that's what he's trying to do. If he were Brer Rabbit, he'd be running off to hide in the briar patch. That's what he's trying to do with that.
He'd be asking us not to throw him in the briar patch, which we've done, I think, decisively.
Very good. Well, hopefully he will fare as well as our friend. So let me see here. Who fared pretty good? It was Fox and Bear who had trouble, right? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. Manipulation tactic number 10. Here we go. Number 10, bully on the playground. Use of mockery and name calling. Did he have to come up with 10? Because this is just so dumb and so weak. It's like, I've got to get 10. Come on, give me something.
And for the record, that's not bullying on the playground, because it's just a fact. These are really silly arguments. I'm not using the ad hominem to say this is a silly argument, therefore you shouldn't believe it. We are just commenting on how ridiculous some of this stuff is and then actually deconstructing it. That's the difference between a valid ad hominem or a legitimate ad hominem and fallacious ad hominem. We're not just calling him names and then stopping there. We're pointing out why the names we're saying are accurate.
Because we don't actually ask you to believe us. We just present the evidence and let you decide for yourself. So the examples he gives of this horrible bully on the playground, this is a manipulation tactic, and apparently it's working on grown-ass adults everywhere. Oh, he is just a TBM, which stands for True Believing Mormon, or, hey, you're in a cult. So who out of 7th grade is going to be influenced by that, do you think?
I don't know. We'll have to ask Mr. Five.
Like I said, he was obviously, I got to have 10. I got to be like Letterman. And he says, critics attempt to manipulate people into accepting their worldviews by name calling or labeling. No one wants to hear that what they are doing is weird. Well, that's okay. It won't be weird in another 200 years, right? No, it will be, because everything will be weird then. That's right. This method is effective. Where? Especially if someone is unsure of their convictions. Okay. What do you think about that? I never say that someone is in a cult. I say that they're in a see you last Tuesday.
I just think if someone's able to make you drop your convictions by just calling you a name, yeah, like you said, are you in 7th grade? Then you never really had convictions.
Was this Austin 5-10 years ago, do you think?
I don't know. I
I'm
don't
not
know.
sure what he left the church over.
I think this one is really silly, and he can call that mockery and name calling. I'm sure he will, but it is just a really silly argument. That's
Yeah.
okay.
Okay.
And
Well,
then you've got examples, I think, of how the church itself engages in these on the next couple slides.
oh my gosh. That's right, I do. See, every slide is it's a revelation to me. I forget what I have. Yeah, here's President Nelson. Lazy learners and lax disciples will always struggle to muster even a particle of faith. He said that. I watched him say that. I've commented on him saying that. Lazy learners and lax disciples. I think he's talking about me. Oh, but this was the manipulation tactic. Oh, bully on the playground, use of mockery and name calling. Apparently, President Nelson is being accused by Austin Fife of being the bully on the playground and engaging in manipulation tactic number 10. It's like love potion number 9. So there's that. Lazy learners and lax disciples. Thank you, President Nelson. Oh, he has more to say. On a day when he was on different medication, he said the following. I am greatly concerned that so many people seem to believe that it is completely acceptable to condemn, malign, and vilify anyone who does not agree with them. Many seem eager to damage another's reputation with pathetic and pithy barbs. Oh, pathetic and pithy barbs. You mean like lazy learners and lax disciples, President Nelson? All right. Manipulations and fallacies. Oh, yes. This is important.
Oh,
And you
yeah.
included this, I know.
Well, and especially right after going on bully on the playground and using like extreme language as a manipulation tactic. This is a quote that Austin has after this section, where he's quoting from Manuel Padro. I don't know who that is, but
I don't know, some hack.
he included it in his work. So in a way,
By the way, this is from a presentation that
right,
was made at Fair Mormon,
right,
but the person being quoted didn't make the presentation. The person being quoted was quoted in the presentation.
right. And then Austin has this quote in it. So he's standing behind what this says, presumably, or he wouldn't
He's
have
adopting it.
Yeah. So he says, I'll read it for the listeners. Now, Mormon stories, the life after ministry, Mormon Think, and a number of other groups are all relying on the same abusive tactic.
How come he can't just put Radio Free Mormon in there?
I know.
I'm feeling offended. RFM, I would take.
You need to go. You need to shark for more clout, RFM. That's what you need to do.
Well, if he takes any of our suggestions, I hope he'll take that one.
Yeah.
And put me first while you're at it, would you, Austin?
They are trying to coerce you into a situation where they can bombard you with so many doubt-provoking questions that they can cause your resolve to collapse and your identity to fall apart. Inside of that vacuum, created by an act of psychological rape, they hope to impregnate you with their own belief system. If that sounds abusive, it's because that's what it is. What were your thoughts on that?
Abusive. It sounds like the kitchen scene in Alien.
Yeah.
That's what it sounds like to me. This guy's a hack. He's a moron. Okay.
Mm-hmm.
They're trying to coerce you. Nobody's trying to coerce you. I do not think that word means what you think it means. They are not trying to coerce you into a situation. It's a freaking podcast. You can watch it if you want. You don't have to. You can turn off anytime you want. If you begin to watch, you can stop the search of your residence at any time. Okay. You can just stop it. It's not being thrust upon you. You are not being forced to watch it. Like, what was that? That movie, A Clockwork Orange. You're not being forced to watch the movie by your eyelids being held open, okay, by mechanical devices. No, you're not being coerced. You're not being bombarded. You're not being anything. And then to say inside of that vacuum, after this bombardment by coercion has collapsed your identity and caused it to fall apart, inside of that vacuum, created by an act of psychological rape. Screw you. What an idiot.
Yeah.
They hope to impregnate you with their own belief system. Yeah. I have no respect for this guy.
Yeah, you want to talk about psychological rape for a second? Every day on our missions, we have to recite multiple, well, at least on my mission, I had to read 10 pages from the White Handbook. I had to stand up and cite all these different talks from Joseph Smith, lines from The Thing. I have my mission handbook just right over
line from the movie The Thing?
No, that would have been
That would be cool.
But like we would read Doctrine and Covenants 4, like, and I'm not accusing the church of doing that, but I'm just saying I've listened to so many different episodes of Mormon Stories. I've listened to every episode of Radio Free Mormon. I have never heard any critic of the church that I've listened to, including ones he has on this list, engage in the type of rhetoric that Austin Fife is adopting by incorporating this into his Light and Truth letter. To compare listening to a podcast that is not forced for you to listen to an act of psychological rape is an insult to people who've actually suffered rape, and it's disgusting. Austin, you should be ashamed of yourself for including this in your letter. This is beyond absurd. This is, again, comes back to my comments about I don't understand how anyone who had a legitimate faith crisis, who says they listen to so many episodes of Mormon Stories, listened to people's pain, sat with people, heard the things that they've been through in this church, could ever use a phrase like psychological rape. That is absurd, and it's disgusting, and Austin should be ashamed of himself.
Austin, it appears the editorial board is unanimous in recommending the deletion of this paragraph from your document. All right. Now, this is on a bit of a different format, but this is still quoting from the first chapter of the Light on Truth letter. Did I put this in? I think I put this in there. I better read this.
Yep.
He writes, I have seen many disillusioned former church members share their faith deconstruction stories. Some are emotional messes after their crisis. I wish the best for those folks. I hope they find the peace that they seek. Highlight, I find it deeply immoral for critics to share half-truths and false narratives with the intent of convincing their victims to turn their lives upside down in a faith crisis. And I highlighted it because I wonder how he feels about the church doing the inverse of that by the same method. And I wonder how he feels about his doing the inverse of that by the same method.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think?
Well, I think that's one of the reasons that I push back on bad apologetics. It's not because I have some hatred for the church. It's not because I have hatred for Austin Fife or Jacob Hansen or any of these people. It's because when they give people really shitty reasons to keep believing in the church, all they're doing is setting these people up for a more painful faith crisis down the road. When you're giving them really bad reasons to believe based on half-truths and false narratives, which we've called you out on multiple times in this chapter where you're criticizing that, Austin, you are setting those people up with brittle faith. When you're leaving things out, like the Lowry Nelson letters, the letter to Stuart Udall, the 1949 statement on the Negro, the SEC order, when you barely deal with the child abuse issue in the church, you are setting people up to fail. You're setting them up with brittle faith that when reality confronts them, they will be like me or they will be like RFM and they will have to have that dark night of the soul and wrestle with these things. You're not doing them any favors by giving them these cute little half-assed apologetics that will keep them in the church, inside of a church that isn't real. You're giving them a fake church to believe in. And that's the reality. And when they realize it, they'll be mad. They'll be mad at you and they'll be mad at the church. People like you create people who treat the church, who criticize the church in the way that you're telling them not to criticize the church because you have zero understanding. I know that here he says, I wish the best for those folks. I don't believe him because so many other examples of his letter demonstrate that I don't think that concern is legitimate. It's just not possible. Those two things are too contradictory.
I thought you were going to say to Austin, people like you create people like us.
I missed the opportunity, damn it.
But that's part of the deal, right? That's why people get angry. That's why they have trouble after leaving the church alone, because it has impacted their lives to such a gigantic degree. And then they discover that it's based upon lies and deception. And all the time, little noobs like Austin Fife are running around giving them cover and saying, no, they're fine. They're fine. You keep being a good Mormon. I think I have one more slide.
Mm-hmm.
And this is another quote. Would you read this, please?
Yeah,
This is
well,
from the chapter as well in the Light on Truth letter.
yep. He says the CS letter lambasts the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints for encouraging members to use divinely appointed sources when researching challenging gospel questions. I admit that this advice from church leaders bothered me for some time. Was I to only look at the church's approved list of reading material? It felt suspicious to me. Then
Wait,
I
there's a
learned,
reason. There's a reason, Austin. There's a reason you felt that way. Because you were right. You
right,
were right.
right.
Until you gaslit yourself back into conformity with the church and doubting the rightness that you had at the outset.
hmm And that's one of the problems with this entire approach is even the phrase light and truth letter, like his title that he selected for this. In the introduction, if you read it, it talks about how he landed on that phrase because when he had a faith crisis, he went to his wife and she said, if you find more light and truth somewhere else, then I'll join you in following that more light and truth. He doesn't even realize how much his introduction gives away the game. By using a phrase like light and truth, he's so clearly showing that the way he would have defined light and truth is the way Mormons define light and truth. So what he did is he decided he was having problems inside of Mormonism and then decided to go see if he could find a more Mormon Mormonism. And he couldn't find a more Mormon Mormonism. Unsurprising. You can even see that in this same paragraph. He's talking about the church the church encouraging members to use divinely appointed sources. How in the world do you know they're divinely appointed sources? They're the sources that the church told you to use. You're just smuggling in that assumption that God speaks through the church, and you're not even recognizing it, dude. You're smuggling in the conclusion in your premise. Like you're begging the question. That's the definition of begging the question. You should have spent more time researching logical fallacies and manipulative tactics because you found yourself completely captured by one.
And this is not the last slide. It goes on. Remember where I expatiated for some time about the carrot on the stick and the donkey? This is where he says it.
Do you want me to read this one as well?
Would you please?
Yeah, of course. He says, short, quick, and easy to understand answers are the most appealing at first glance. Oh, like doubt your doubts? More so with the advent of social.
Sorry. Yes.
More so with the advent of social media. When confronted with challenging and unflattering information, it is tempting to accept it. At times, it felt easier for me to say that the church was lying and that Joseph Smith was a fraud. Knowing the whole story would take too much effort. When I realized this, I started to see how manipulative critics of the church can be with their use of the internet. Wow. They want to capitalize on the natural tendency to want simple answers with little work. Okay, I want to pause there for a second.
Please
There's
do.
this trope that it's harder to stay in the church. It is not. I can tell you right now, my life would have been so much easier if my wife and I would have continued going to the church. Leaving the church cost me professional opportunities. It cost me friendships. It cost me family relationships. Leaving the church, whether you agree with it or not, is indisputably the harder path. I'm not saying you have to agree that it's the correct path, but I grew up in Mormonism. I am in a heavily Mormon dominated area. I gained nothing by leaving the church, and it cost me a lot. Austin.
Do you know why I think that Isaac Newton agrees with you?
Why is that?
Because I think he posited that an object at rest tends to remain at rest unless moved upon by an outside force.
Yeah, I've often joked too that as an attorney, I could have been a contender in the church.
Yes, you could have been. You could have risen to great levels.
Yep. I guess I traded it for the mess of pottage of truth. And then he says, I was, and in some ways still am, one of these members. I did not know nearly enough, even after engaging with critics of the church for years. You still don't. I'll just go ahead and tell you right now. Part of the problem is that I have a job and a family. Who has the time, resources, and capacity to become a historian and scholar overnight? I don't think people are expecting you to become a historian and scholar. But the bottom line is, if you care about truth, you care about truth. My wife can attest that the Book of Abraham was a huge issue for me during my faith crisis. I literally woke her up at 4:30 in the morning one night where I'm going over Dan Vogel's book and explaining to her, comparing to the transcripts, or the resources on Joseph Smith papers, and showing her the documents from the Book of Abraham and showing her the actual manuscript that Joseph Smith translated, at least partially in his own handwriting. Like, I'm sorry. That's what it takes sometimes. Like, Mormonism is a complicated web to unweave. But man, once you unweave it even a little bit and you start to see, there's just the patterns are too much to ignore, Austin.
Let me just check this one. Yeah, that's the last slide that we have. But see how it's smuggled in here. And it's not really even smuggled. It's pretty much stated outright that who has the time to study and research these things? And as long as we don't have the time to study and research, then they will seem like insoluble problems with the church. But if we had the time and we could become a scholar or a historian and really research the hell out of it, then that would resolve all our problems. That's the carrot in front of the donkey. I'm here to tell you, I've done the research, I've done the scholarship. Okay, I've been published twice in BYU Studies. I've been published twice in the Journal of Book of Mormon Studies, put out by then the Foundation for Ancient Research in Mormon Studies. I have been around the block. I've done the research. I've done the scholarship. It doesn't get better. It only gets worse. That's the issue. This is a false hope that you're holding out, Austin. Now, you don't know it's a false hope because obviously you haven't done the research. And I'm not trying to be pejorative with that. You haven't done the research. You don't know the history. So you're not lying. It's a false hope that you've convinced yourself of too from other people who should know better, who may themselves be historians, Steve Harper, and say things like this when they are absolute falsehoods. This is like, in an unpolemical kind of way, back when I was in my 20s, in the 1980s, and I was trying to study the Bible a little bit and understand things, and I felt from my study that if I could learn Hebrew, which I wasn't planning on doing, and I still haven't, and if I could learn Greek, which I wasn't planning on doing and still haven't, but if scholars got together and they learned, they spent their lives learning the Hebrew and the Greek and the underlying languages, then all of that learning and study would bring them, like climbing a mountain, to the mountaintop where they would all reach the same agreement and the same understanding about what the Bible said. And it was only a few decades later, when I was doing more study on the Bible, including Bart Ehrman in my studies and other scholars who are not Mormons, that I realized the exact opposite is true. The more you study the Bible, the more experts are probably going to disagree on that. Okay. And that may be putting it too widely. Let me just put it this clearly. All experts will agree with me on this. There is no nirvana at the top of the mountain where all scholars come to the same understanding about the Bible and hold hands and sing Kumbaya. In the same way, it doesn't get better for church history. You can study polygamy as much as you want. It's never going to resolve the problem that Joseph Smith was marrying teenagers and women who were already married to other men, as if having multiple wives wasn't bad enough, but some of them being teenagers, some of them already married to other men, and doing a lot of it behind your wife's back. There's no amount of study of history that's going to make that okay. There's no amount of studying in history that's going to say, oh, well, he didn't marry teenagers. There's no amount of studying in history that's going to make it, oh, he didn't marry other men's wives. And there's no amount of study in history that's going to say that Emma was okay with all of it.
Right. And to your point about historians, it was literally a trope in the church when I was growing up that you don't want to study too much church history because that's how people lose their testimonies. Like, think about what that really says for a second, Austin. Like, imagine an analogy where there's some pharmaceutical, some drug that the more you know about it, the less likely you are to use it. Do you recognize what that's saying? I think my closing thought, I actually just looked this up. It isn't on the slides, but I think about this quote from Carl Sagan a lot from Demon Haunted World. Carl Sagan wrote Demon Haunted World in 96, right before he died. And I'm amazed how prescient he was in calling out how we need to increase civics education. We need to increase public participation in our democracy. We need to increase science education or we're doomed. And one of the quotes from that book that just stands out to me so much is he says this. He says, one of the saddest lessons of history is this. If we've been bamboozled long enough, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We are no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It is simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we've been taken. For once you give a charlatan power over you, you almost never give it back. And I know we've said some harsh things about Austin. We've had a good time. We've joked. But the reality is, Austin, your approach of thinking you can just reverse the burden of proof and you can put it on the critics to explain away your beliefs, that's not the way critical thinking works, bro. You've been captured by the bamboozle. That's very clear in reading your work. It just is. You can't have that level of blatant contradiction. And I'd also add, for all the apologetic channels that had Austin on to talk about the Light and Truth letter, how damning is it that Jacob Hansen or Ward Radio didn't point out any of these obvious, patently absurd errors that you and I noticed, like right off the bat. And the fact that our side, the critical side, cares about truth enough to correct each other and to correct ourselves, and the apologetic side doesn't. What does that say? What does that say? Going back to our analogy about the drugs, one drug manufacturer corrects its errors, the other does not. Which side are you going to choose? The bamboozle or the unbamboozlers?
Well, whatever it says, I don't think it's very flattering about Austin or our friends at Psych Ward Radio. Or Jacob Hansen either.
Or the clout shark Jacob Hansen.
Yes, or the clout shark. Well, thank you so much for joining me tonight, Colby. And I had a great time. I think this was a lot of fun. And I want to know from the audience, if you thought it was fun, if you think it's worth continuing. Colby, it says he's willing. I know he's ready and able. He says he's willing. I will do it if there's enough interest. We can go through different chapters and we can go through them in a way that we did tonight. Maybe we'll even go through it in less than 2 hours. We'll work on that, compressing that down. I'm sorry. Did you want to respond to that?
I just was going to say, if we're doing another chapter, my one suggestion would be, and we can pitch this to the audience, but I would love to cover the abuse in the church chapter, because I read that chapter, like I said. So the 3 I've read: first chapter, church finances, after your episode, and I read abuse in the church just because I wanted to go see and look, as someone who cares a lot about that issue, how he deals with it. And I would love to blow that apart. So if people are interested in that, let us know. And RFM, I had a great time. I love hanging out with you. I love your show. I think you're a wonderful person. I don't care what anyone else says about you.
Well, thank you, because I don't care what anybody else says about me either. I agree with you because you're the guest, and it is the host's duty to agree with the guest. So thank you for coming. Thank you, everybody, for watching. Please hit like. Please hit subscribe. Thank you to all of you who have gone to radiofreemormon.org and made a donation. Your donations are what keep me broadcasting behind enemy lines. And tonight, I'm honored to be able to broadcast from behind enemy lines with a great guest like Colby Reddish. So thank you, everybody, once again, and I'll see you next time. Good night.